Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight's lore, we're diving into lore behind the Silver Skulls and why they're still loyalists of the Iron Warriors. Before I get into the madness, be sure to like, comment your videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe from the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get to the madness.
There are truths in the Imperium of man that are hunted more ruthlessly than heresy. Not because they are fouler than heresy. Not because they stink more strongly of the warp, mutation, apostasy, or the long clawing laughter of the dark gods. They are hunted because they unsettle order. They gnaw at the sacred geometry of imperial certainty. They cast their shadow not across a single shrine world, not across a single archive vault or fortress monastery, but across the comforting lies by which the Imperium keeps itself upright amidst the corpse dust of 10,000 years. This is one such truth, or perhaps it is one such possibility, which in the 41st millennium is often far more dangerous. The Silver Skulls are loyal. That much is beyond serious dispute. They have bled for the Emperor's dominion. They have answered the call of war in the black gulfs between the stars. They have cast themselves into the furnace of the Imperium's unending wars and emerged, if not unbroken, then at least unbowed. They have stood with the sons of Guilliman. They have been named among the defenders who gird Ultramar against the darkness beyond its marches. Their silver warplate has gleamed beneath the same suns that shine upon the worlds of Macragge's realm, and their battle brothers have died with Bolter in gauntlet, and the Emperor's cause still clenched in their hearts, like a final spasm of faith. No stain of open treachery clings to them. No evident taint of the warp blackens their gene seed in the vulgar and obvious manner that lesser men always hope for, because lesser men adore simple monsters. They want corruption to come horned and slavering. They want betrayal to announce itself with shrieking demon faces in the steel. They want truth to be crude, so that loyalty may remain clean. But truth is rarely so obedient. The Silver Skulls stand before the Imperium as a chapter of proper record. They wear their honor openly. They prosecute war as space marines ought, with discipline, fury, and the cold exactitude of transhuman purpose. Their name is not spat as a curse in the halls of terror. Their heraldry has not been struck from the rolls of the Adeptus Astartes. Their fortress has not been ringed by the guns of those sent to erase a bloodline from the Emperor's Book of Wrath. In all the ways that matter to the public face of imperial order, they are spotless enough, useful enough, proven enough. And yet there are names that sit too neatly in the archives, and names that seem to have been pinned there by force. The Silver Skulls belong to the latter breed. For a chapter of such visible loyalty, there lingers around them a chill of concealment too heavy to ignore. It is not the wild nonsense of voidsmen murmuring over Amasek in a docking crypt. It is not the fever babble of underhive scavengers inventing scandal because the silence of the stars drives men to fill it with their own stupidity. This is not gutter gossip. This is not the mewling of the ignorant. This is the scent that clings to records sealed too tightly, to bloodlines spoken of with excessive care, to truths that were not burned because they were false, but because they were inconveniently alive. That is the distinction which matters. In the Imperium, a dead falsehood may be left to rot in some forgotten parchment chamber. A living truth is another matter entirely. A living truth must be locked away, redacted, stripped of its teeth, buried beneath layers of doctrine, censored testimony, sanctified omission, and the leaden insistence that the approved answer is the only answer fit for loyal minds. If the Silver Skulls are precisely what the public record declares them to be, why does the question of their blood feel less like settled genealogy and more like a sealed vault door buried under a fortress of official silence? That is the wound at the center of this matter. That is the contradiction from which the blood seeps. They are held to be sons of Guilliman. So it is said. So it is taught. So it is repeated in the proper registers and honored among the proper circles. They are counted among the loyal descendants of Ultramar's martial order. They are treated as a shield at the edge of Gilliman's domain, another blade in the ordered constellation of chapters that stand between the Imperium and the Void's innumerable hungers. To question such things in the wrong chamber, before the wrong listener, is to invite the sort of silence that comes after a bolt round has entered the skull. And still the question remains, why this guardedness? Why this pressure in the blood records? Why this sense, impossible to dismiss once noticed, that something in the line has been pressed flat rather than laid bare? Not exposed and disproven, pressed flat, as if a hand of great authority descended upon a troublesome truth and held it down until the parchment ceased to move. It is easy, in weaker settings and lesser ages, to imagine that heresy is the Imperium's greatest fear. It is not. Heresy is expected. Heresy is the daily weather of mankind's decline. Worlds rebel, governors blaspheme, cardinals sell whole populations into spiritual rot. Regiments break, captains turn, astropaths scream with the voices of things that were never born and can never die. The Imperium knows all of this. It is built to survive all of this. Its cruelty is old because its enemies are older. But the question that truly disquiets the Empire is colder than common heresy. Can loyal blood come from a traitor line and remain loyal? Not for a day. Not in one noble exception raised up for song and absolution. Not in some fleeting battlefield act where a damned son buys a moment of redemption with his own death. Those tales are tolerable. The Imperium can digest martyrs. It can digest anomalies, provided they end beautifully and do not breed consequences. But what of lineage? What of inheritance? What of an enduring chapter, honored in war, steadfast in oath, functioning within the Emperor's realm for centuries upon centuries, while somewhere beneath its polished heraldry there lingers a genetic and historical debt to one of the legions damned by the memory of the Horus heresy? That is a different matter. That question threatens more than pedigree. It threatens myth. It threatens the sacred simplifications upon which the Adeptus Astartes rest so much of their identity. It threatens the clean wall the Imperium pretends exists between the loyal dead and the traitor dead, between the blood that may be venerated and the blood that must only be cursed. It threatens the fantasy that history sorted itself cleanly when the galaxy burned, and that all polluted lines were cast one way while all pure lines stood the other. The galaxy was never so generous, and so this inquiry must proceed with the proper severity, not as a declaration carved in adamantium by the High Lords, not as some pompous claim that terror itself has confessed in trembling script what 10,000 years of imperial bureaucracy were too weak to conceal. That would be foolish. The archives of the Imperium do not yield their most dangerous truths in such obliging fashion. There is no stamped confession to be held aloft here, no single scrap of parchment that, when unfurled, causes every doubt to die. What there is instead is pattern, pressure, atmosphere, doctrine on one side, behavior on another, and behind both, like a dead giant's shadow cast across a ruined wall, the memory of the Horus heresy. That is how the case must be built, from three fronts, as any worthy siege is prosecuted. First, from official doctrine, from what the Imperium says, how it classifies, what it permits to be known, and what it veils. Second, from battlefield behavior, from the habits of war that outlast color, name, and even declared ancestry. Third, from history itself, from the old wound of the legions, because no honest study of Astartes' blood can ignore the age when brother slew brother and entire bloodlines were hurled into damnation or legend. The silver skulls stand at the crossroads of those three approaches. On the parchment, they are one thing. In war, they suggest another. In the long echo of the heresy, they awaken a suspicion the Imperium would prefer remain unspoken. That is why this matter matters. If it were true, not merely in the muttering way of conspiracies, but in the deeper, more poisonous manner of a theory that aligns too well with the silences around it, then the consequences would not be small. This would not be some decorative revelation for archivists and lawkeepers to admire. It would strike at founding myths. It would foul the already troubled waters of chapter legitimacy. It would remind the Adeptus Astartes and all those imperial institutions that rely upon neat genealogies that usefulness is often preserved ahead of purity, and that the Imperium may have survived 10,000 years not by honesty, but by the ruthless management of truths too dangerous to proclaim. That is always the ugliest lesson. Not that the Imperium lies. Any child born under hive smog learns that soon enough. The ugliest lesson is that the Imperium lies most fiercely where the lie preserves function, where a weapon remains useful, where a bloodline still kills the Emperor's enemies with sufficient devotion, where the cost of speaking plainly exceeds the cost of silence. So keep before you the image that will haunt every step of this descent. Silver over iron, a skull polished to a holy brightness so no eye lingers too long on the metal beneath. A chapter that marches in loyalty beneath a name of death, its armor gleaming like sanctified bone beneath a battlefield sun, while under the litanies, under the heraldry, under the approved bloodline and the emperor-blessed formalities, there may yet endure something older, harsher, more bitterly resilient than the public record dares admit. Not corruption. That would almost be simpler. Inheritance. Not damnation in the present tense, but origin in the past tense. Not a chapter fallen to treason, but a chapter perhaps born from a truth the Imperium has never known how to speak aloud. And if such a thought seems impossible, if it seems an affront to all the ordered myths of the Adeptus Astartes, then hold that reaction close. It is the right reaction. It is the Imperial reaction. It is the instinct that has kept certain vaults sealed and certain records smothered beneath classification and fear. It is precisely because the idea feels intolerable that it deserves to be examined. For there was, in the age of civil war, one son of the 4th Legion whose loyalty did not break when his brothers broke. One warrior of iron who did not bend the knee to Horus, though the galaxy itself cracked open and the Primarchs drowned worlds in blood. One name that survives like a blade tip protruding from the mountain of old lies, refusing burial, refusing silence, refusing the comfort of simple history. That name is Barabas Dantioch. Open the sanctioned archive first. Always. Before the whispered heresies of apocryphal lineages, before the blood-remembered suspicion that clings to certain chapter names, before the temptation to drag every half-buried rumor into the light and declare it revelation, there is the approved record. There is the truth, as the Imperium permits it to exist in parchment, in gene vault notation, in librarium index, in those great vaults of ordered memory, where a million lesser lies are chained together until they resemble certainty. If one is to speak of the silver skulls with any seriousness at all, then one must begin there, not in the underhive fashion of loose tongues and diseased speculation, but as any dutiful archivist of the Adeptus Terra would begin, with the sanctioned version, with the official bloodline, with the answer the Imperium itself is willing to stamp with wax and call sufficient. And the sanctioned version is clean, admirably so. It has the polished severity of a shrine floor washed after sacrifice. The silver skulls are set down in approved lore as descendants of the Ultramarines, scions of Guilliman's vast martial inheritance, one among the many chapters that carry the cultural and strategic imprint of the Primarch of Macraga into the long decay of the current age. Their claim to such descent is not treated in public doctrine as scandalous or dubious in the vulgar sense, but as part of the functioning order of the Adeptus Astartes. They are recorded as behaving as a codex chapter, and in the outward life of war, they stand in the company of Guilliman's greater lineage as though that kinship were accepted fact. They have fought beside the so-called primogenitor successors as brothers in all but the oldest blood memory. and in the age after Guilliman's return, they were recognized among his own wider scions. This matters. It matters more than many suspicions care to admit, because the official record is not shy about what the Silver Skulls are supposed to be. They are not left drifting in some nameless category of uncertain Astartes inheritance, nor are they confined to the margins as a chapter too obscure to classify with confidence. The parchment places them within the ultramarine sphere. The quills of Imperial authority write them into the legacy of the 13th Legion. They are not merely tolerated in that role, they function within it. They wear its assumptions. They benefit from its legitimacy. When the Imperium looks upon the Silver Skulls in the approved mirror of doctrine, it does not see a problem to be endured. It sees another blade in Guilliman's hand. Their public image follows accordingly. Discipline, order, martial orthodoxy. Not joyless, for joy is a luxury denied to most Astartes, but precise, useful, cold in the proper way. The Silver Skulls are described as largely shaped by the Codex Astartes, which is to say they stand beneath the long administrative shadow of Robut Guilliman, even when their customs and tribal devotions render them strange in detail. The broad bones of their war are recognizable to any son of Ultramar. Command structure, company shape, battlefield adaptability, the hard lesson that war is not simply savagery, but system. Whatever savagery the Silver Skulls possess, the public record insists that it is caged inside doctrine. They are functionally loyal beyond serious question. They do not wear their allegiance in sentiment, but in utility, in repeat service, in blood offered to the Imperium across campaign after campaign. Such legitimacy deepens further when one considers the place they occupy not merely in genealogy, but in strategic trust. The Silver Skulls are counted among the shield chapters of Ultramar, among those ultramarine-descended chapters charged with helping defend Guilliman's realm itself. That is not the kind of burden placed upon a doubtful weapon. Ultramar is no remote oubliette of the Imperium, where second-rate assets may be hidden behind distance and prayer. It is one of the spiritual and martial hearts of Loyalist Astartes power, a realm so symbolically burdened that every world within its protective ring carries meaning far beyond its atmosphere. To be assigned among its shield chapters is to be brought close to the furnace of legitimacy. It is a declaration of trust so practical that it becomes theological. The Silver Skulls are not merely said to be Guilliman's sons. They are placed where Guilliman's sons are expected to stand. Pause there, and the shape of the official truth becomes clearer. This is not some fringe brotherhood haunting the edges of segmentum obscurity, some half-forgotten founding mistake skulking around a dead star and hoping no inquisitorial attention ever drifts its way. The Silver Skulls are too near the center of ultramarine legitimacy for that. Too visible, too integrated into the accepted architecture of Loyalist power. They have stood beside those chapters whose blood claims are held in greater public certainty. They have been permitted nearness to the Primarch's restored sphere. Their name is not one the Imperium handles with tongs. It is named with the assured composure reserved for useful institutions. That is the sanctioned record. That is what the Imperium wants read aloud. And that, precisely, is why the suspicion surrounding them becomes explosive. If the Silver Skulls were some isolated and little-regarded chapter, a remote anomaly buried in a dull sector of administrative neglect, their bloodline would scarcely matter beyond specialist circles of the Inquisition, the Mechanicus biologist sects, and those few chroniclers sick enough in spirit to care about hidden inheritance more than actual war. But the Silver Skulls are not politically insignificant. They sit too close to the myth of ultramarine continuity, too close to the idea that Guilliman's line remains a pillar of ordered martial inheritance in a galaxy where almost everything else has become cracked, polluted, or absurd. A mystery at the edge of nowhere is one thing. A mystery nested inside one of the Imperium's most symbolically important blood trees is another entirely. That is why the air thickens around the matter. That is why the theory, if advanced at all, cannot be advanced lightly. The more publicly orthodox the Silver Skulls appear, the more catastrophic any deeper contradiction would become. Their outward order is not a weakness in the suspicious case. It is the pressure seal. It is what makes the whole business dangerous. A chapter already marked by visible deviance would prove little by revealing yet more deviance. But a chapter plated in spotless legitimacy, one welcomed among Ultramar's defenders, one written into the realm of Guilliman as a working son rather than a tolerated cousin, would shake far more foundations if the iron under the silver proved to come from elsewhere. And yet, even while the official record speaks with such composure, there remains that deeper instinct, that old tension in the parchment fibers, that sensation every serious student of Imperial history eventually learns to recognize. Some entries in the archives feel settled, others feel settled upon. Some names lie easily in the ledger, others seem pinned there, as though the page beneath them once tried to curl. The Silver Skulls have always carried that latter sensation. Not open contradiction, not enough for the crude pleasure of easy exposure, but pressure. The sanctioned truth says ultramarines, the strategic record says trusted, the public conduct says loyal, codified, honored. And still the line refuses to sit entirely still in the mind. That is not proof. It must never be mistaken for proof. Instinct is a dangerous servant in any age, and in the 41st millennium it has birthed cults, pogroms, and planetary massacres. But instinct does have its place in the reading of Imperial records, because men who study enough sanctioned history begin to notice where certainty has been overfed. They learn to hear the difference between a truth written with confidence and a truth repeated with force. The Silver Skulls invite that second sensation. Their orthodoxy is so complete in presentation that it begins, perversely, to cast its own shadow. Look at the approved image the Imperium offers, and the paradox sharpens further. Here is a chapter that broadly mirrors Codex doctrine, that has fought as kin among the primogenitor successors, that has been acknowledged among Guilliman's sons, that has stood near enough to Ultramar to be counted among its protective ring. Here is a force whose loyalty indeed is easier to establish than the loyalty of half the petty lords, generals, and cardinals who speak against hidden bloodlines in the first place. Here is a chapter whose service record gives no obvious gift to the lazy accuser, no glaring mutation, no open apostasy, no theatrical degeneration into the obvious signatures of damnation. If one wishes to doubt them, one cannot do so by easy means. One must doubt from within the very structures that affirm them. That is the core wound, and it deserves to be spoken plainly. Are the Silver Skulls exactly what the Imperium says they are, or have they become something even more valuable to Imperial survival, what the Imperium needs them to be? There is a difference between those two conditions, and the Imperium has built entire ages atop that difference. A thing may be named for convenience, shelved for stability, sanctified for political hygiene, all while some older and more difficult truth remains locked beneath the naming. This is no rare phenomenon in the empire of the corpse throne. The administratum classifies to preserve function. The Inquisition conceals to preserve order. The Adeptus Astartes themselves survive as much by inherited myth as by biological continuity. The Imperium does not simply record history, it weaponizes memory. It turns usable truth into dogma and unusable truth into ash. So when a chapter like the Silver Skulls stands robed in perfect official legitimacy, while a trace of unease still clings to its lineage, the careful observer should not dismiss the unease merely because the robe is splendid. He should study the robe more closely, for the sanctioned version always comes first. It must. Any theory worthy of the name must survive contact with the strongest available form of the official account. One does not begin with the heretical possibility and then scramble backward toward evidence like a charlatan hawking prophecy in a market of bones. One begins where the Imperium itself begins, with the clean genealogy, with the ultramarine inheritance, with the honored service, with the place among Guilliman's defenders, with the certainty the Empire is willing to lend the matter. Then, and only then, does one ask whether the certainty is whole or merely useful. That is the discipline required here. That is the only way to proceed without slipping into stupidity. The official story must be taken with deadly seriousness, because every forbidden suspicion worth preserving begins by kneeling before the sanctioned record and taking it utterly seriously. It should have been a simple file. That is where the unease ceases to be instinct and begins to harden into something sterner. Public heraldry can lie by omission for 10,000 years and still pass unchallenged beneath the gaze of the Imperium. Banners are painted, honors are recited, deeds are arranged in proper procession until even a flawed lineage may be made to look like an unbroken chain of sanctified service. A chapter can be presented to the galaxy in ceremonial colors and approved blood claims, its plate polished, its record formal, its dead praised in all the approved canticles of sacrifice. Such things are easy. The Imperium excels at surface order. It survives by surface order. It armors itself in appearances because appearances are often all that stand between mankind and spiritual collapse. But a file is different. A blood record should not require theatre. It should not need mythic language or strategic vagueness or the ritual insistence that all is well because loyal men have said so often enough. A gene seed lineage, particularly that of a chapter long established and long-blooded in the Emperor's wars, ought to sit in the vaults with the cold clarity of a bolt shell in a magazine. Indexed, cross-marked, verified, sealed against tampering, yes, but not sealed against comprehension. A file of such import should speak plainly to those empowered to read it. It should answer the oldest and simplest question the Adeptus Astartes can ask of their own flesh. Whose sons are these? With the silver skulls, that answer does not arrive with the ease it should. This is the point at which the matter ceases to be decorative suspicion and becomes something heavier, not because the records are absent in some crude and melodramatic fashion. Missing archives are almost mundane in the Imperium. Worlds burn, data crypts fail, administratum cathedra collapse beneath the weight of their own age. Cogitator banks are consumed by dust, war, neglect, bureaucratic duplication, or the sort of malice that passes for governance in many sectors. An incomplete record on its own proves little in an empire built on the bones of lost information. The silver skulls are more troubling than that. Their blood records do not merely seem incomplete, they feel withheld. That distinction matters. It matters with all the force of a locked reliquary in a room full of open shrines. There is a difference between a file eroded by time and a file clenched shut by will. One bears the stink of decay, the other bears the pressure of intent. With the silver skulls, the suspicion has always clung not to obvious ruin, but to unusual sensitivity. Their records are not presented as the kind of straightforward genealogical inheritance that one would expect from a chapter so publicly established within the ultramarine sphere. They are difficult, protected, treated less like ordinary confirmation and more like material whose handling must itself be controlled. Not simply absent, not simply damaged, sealed. A sealed thing invites reverence in the Imperium. It also invites dread, for what is sealed is not always sacred. Often, it is merely dangerous. Sometimes the two are the same. The public face of the silver skulls, as already shown, is one of acceptable certainty. They are listed where they ought to be listed, named where they ought to be named, integrated into the ordered architecture of Loyalist history. Yet when the matter passes from heraldry to blood, from approved descent to the flesh truth buried in gene vault notation, the line begins to blur. The simple answer becomes guarded. The expected confidence becomes pressure. And once that pressure is felt, every silence around it gains weight. That is why the intervention of imperial authority matters so greatly here. Not because the Imperium investigates anything and everything with equal fervor. It does not. It triages suspicion according to usefulness, danger, politics, and appetite. Entire sectors may drown in corruption, while inquisitors argue precedence and ordos feud over jurisdiction. But when the Ordo Hereticus turns its gaze upon a chapter's bloodline, that alone is enough to strip the matter of innocence. It means that somewhere beyond common rumor, beyond archivist unease, and the mutterings of suspicious brethren, the machinery of the Imperium itself found reason to look deeper. That alone is a wound in the facade. Consider what it means. The Silver Skulls were not merely the subject of idle genealogical curiosity. They drew the attention of those whose sacred duty is to sniff out rot in the soul of the Imperium, whether that rot takes the form of sorcery, hidden apostasy, tainted relics, spiritual contamination, or doctrines diseased enough to birth schism. The Ordo Hereticus does not pry into Astartes' blood for sport. When it does, the cause is seldom trivial. Imperial power does not reach into a chapter's flesh history without expectation of consequence. And what did that scrutiny reveal? Not what lesser minds would hope for, not mutation writ plain in the helix, not the spore of demons in the veins, not corruption that could be pointed at with relieved disgust and denounced in one of the old easy words. No claws protruding from the gene line, no warp stink rising from the vault, no obscene proof that the Silver Skulls had been walking in secret damnation while the Imperium looked elsewhere. That would have made this simpler, cruder, easier to punish, easier to understand, easier to file beneath the ancient and familiar category of corruption. But the Silver Skulls were found free of taint. That is the blade turn. That is the moment the matter ceases to belong to the realm of contamination and enters the colder realm of origin. Because if a chapter is examined and found impure, then the danger is obvious. Purge, quarantine, censure, annihilation, if need demands. The Imperium understands that language. It may hesitate to act for political reasons, but the moral architecture is already built. Corruption has a place in the taxonomy of imperial fear. There are litanies for it. There are weapons for it. There are pyres enough to swallow whole generations. Origin is more difficult. Origin cannot always be burned without burning the myths built around it. Origin reaches backward. It touches foundings, primarchs, oaths, the memory of the legions, the way chapters speak of themselves in their private halls, the way they kneel before their own relics and believe the blood in their bodies descends by honorable line from hallowed ancestors. Corruption threatens a chapter's present. Origin threatens its self-understanding. Corruption says you have become something foul. Origin asks whether you ever were what you believed yourself to be. That is a far more dangerous question. This is why one phrase matters above all others in the blood shadow hanging over the Silver Skulls. Not taint, not mutation, not contamination. The phrase that truly matters is this: a truth capable of causing schism within the chapter. Study that wording as a chaplain studies the crack in a shrine icon. Do not rush past it. Let it sit in the dark and stare back. A truth capable of causing schism within the chapter is more damning in one sense than a simple charge of impurity, because impurity unites a brotherhood in one of two familiar ways. Either they reject the accusation and stand together against it, or the accusation proves true, and the brotherhood is judged from without. In either case, the lines are clear, outside and inside, loyal and tainted, judge and condemned. The Imperium knows how to survive such divisions because they are externalized. They become war. But a truth capable of causing schism within the chapter suggests something else entirely. It suggests an answer that does not merely invite censure from outside authorities, but division among the brethren themselves. An answer under which some would continue to kneel to the same banners while seeing them differently forever after. An answer that would not simply condemn, but split. Not because the chapter had fallen, but because the chapter's understanding of its own blood would become impossible to hold in common. That is a nightmare of a different order. If the hidden matter were merely administrative, no such language would be necessary. If this was some dry tangle of fragmented records, some loss of parchment continuity, some tiresome discrepancy in dating or tithe notation, or the ordinary rot of Imperial bookkeeping, it would not threaten a chapter's internal cohesion. Battle brothers do not break faith with one another because a gene ledger was copied badly 6,000 years before their birth. They do not divide into rival understandings of themselves because some clerk on Terra blundered a designation during a founding already half lost to ash. Bureaucratic confusion breeds frustration, not schism. Schism requires meaning. Schism requires a truth sharp enough to enter the soul of an institution and split it along lines of belief, honor, ancestry, legitimacy, and duty. It requires something that would force brothers to ask whether the names they have spoken in reverence were truly theirs to claim. Whether the blood in their veins comes from where they were taught it came from. Whether loyalty itself can remain pure when inheritance is not what it seemed. Whether service to the Emperor is enough to overwrite all prior sin, or whether old blood carries old shadows no matter how brightly armor is polished. Now the matter darkens properly, because once that phrase is admitted, once one accepts that the danger surrounding the Silver Skulls lies not in vulgar taint, but in a truth with the power to divide the chapter against itself, then the facade changes shape. The polished image remains. The silver plate still gleams. The skull badge is still borne with perfect martial pride. The approved record still speaks in the composed voice of doctrinal certainty. But a fracture has appeared beneath it all, not in the flesh by way of mutation, but in the story by way of implication. The first real crack in the facade is not that the Silver Skulls are impure. It is that they may be something far worse in the eyes of the Imperium. They may be politically unbearable. To speak the name Barabas Dantioch is to step backward into the first great wound and stare into the furnace before the ash settled. One does not reach for him out of sentiment. One reaches for him because without him, this entire suspicion would sag beneath its own audacity. Without him, the notion of loyal blood enduring within the line of the Iron Warriors would remain little more than a pleasing blasphemy, a theory too neat for the grime of real history. Dantioch is the reason that the thought refuses burial. He was a warsmith of the Iron Warriors, assigned to the 51st Expedition Fleet during the Great Crusade, and when the galaxy broke beneath Horus, he did not break with it. He remained true to the Emperor, while the greater mass of the Fourth Legion turned its iron toward treachery. That fact alone is enough to poison every easy certainty that came after. He matters because he was not some aberration wearing another legion's soul. He was not an Iron Warrior only in technicality, some son of Perturabo softened by another Primarch's virtues, or remade into a more palatable kind of hero for softer ages. He was iron through and through, a builder of fortresses, a reader of stone, pressure, geometry, fire lanes, attrition curves, collapse points, and structural truth. He understood war not as pageantry, but as mathematics written in blood and masonry. He possessed that hard, joyless competence that marked the finest of the Fourth Legion, the gift of seeing a wall not as an object, but as an argument waiting to be ended. In him, one finds the qualities that make the Legion memorable even to those who hate it most. Siege mastery, endurance beyond any sane measure, bitterness honed to a weapon's edge, and the capacity to continue when lesser men would call survival a kind of defeat. That bitterness did not come to him without cause. Dantioch had once stood high in Perturabo's regard, but the galaxy is never more merciless than when it punishes competence with catastrophe. During the campaign against a Hrud migration in the Gugan system, he obeyed his Primarch's order to prosecute compliance at all costs. The cost proved hideous. The Hrud did not merely kill in the common fashion of bolt and blade. Their entropy curse rolled across flesh, armor, and machine alike, withering what it touched. Dantioch and the warriors under his command suffered terribly, and he himself was aged by an estimated span of several thousand years in an atrocity of accelerated decay that left him old in form while still trapped within the unnatural stamina of his transhuman frame. His fleet was effectively broken. The reward for such endurance was not mercy, nor honor, but disgrace. When he dared to question the wisdom of the campaign and the assumptions behind it, Perturabo expunged his name from records, stripped him of favor, and cast him into exile at Lesser Damantine, ordering him to bring the world to compliance and never show his face to his Primarch again. Look carefully there, because the shape of Dantioch's later loyalty is already visible in that punishment. He did not become a loyalist, because life had been kind to him. He did not remain with the Emperor, because the Fourth Legion had offered him abundance, brotherhood, or easy reverence. He stood where he stood after humiliation, after bodily ruin, after the sort of political maiming that would have given many others every excuse to betray. His bitterness was real, his wounds were real, his isolation was real, but none of it flowered into treason. That is what makes him dangerous to simplistic history. He disproves the lazy assumption that bitterness naturally seeks Horus, that wounded pride always crawls toward damnation, that the sons of Perturabo were somehow destined in their very marrow to become what they became. Dantioch had every human reason to curdle. He did not. He endured. On Lesser Damantine, he did what Iron Warriors do when stripped of everything except their craft. He built. The fortress he raised there, the Schadenhold, was not merely a bastion of stone and gunmetal. It was a statement of identity, a refusal to become lesser because he had been cast aside. Then came the Heresy, and with it the moment that reveals the true shape of his soul. When warsmith Idris Krendel arrived to claim the fortress for Horus as a resupply point, Dantioch refused. He did not negotiate. He did not seek half measures. He did not reframe obedience to suit the new constellation of power. He simply refused to betray the Emperor. Then he did what came most naturally to his blood and his training. He prepared to hold. For 366 days, he and his meager loyalist force, the warriors later remembered as the Sons of Dantioch, endured a brutal siege against traitor Iron Warriors and allied strength, spending lives, ammunition, armor, and hope with the dreadful discipline that only siege masters truly understand. The defense of the Schadenhold is not important merely because it was brave. Bravery is common enough in Imperial legend that it loses texture. Men are always brave when dead chroniclers need them to be. The Schadenhold matters because it offers a template for what a loyalist Iron Warrior actually looks like when trapped under impossible pressure. Not radiant, not idealistic, not transfigured into some more decorative form of nobility. Dantioch remained exactly what his legion had made him, only turned against the traitors. Technical, stubborn, resourceful, economical with hope, willing to spend everything if the exchange rate favored strategic denial. When the fortress was finally doomed, he did not surrender to glorious futility. He turned collapse into a weapon, detonating charges at structural weak points, bringing the whole edifice down into the burning depths below, wrecking the traitors' objective and denying them the material prize for which they had bled. Then, with the sort of grim audacity only true Iron Warriors ever seem to find rational, he and his survivors teleported to the enemy flagship, deceived the crew long enough to reach the bridge, seized the vessel, and made for Terra to continue the war. Outnumbered, punished, nearly erased, and still unbroken. There is the pattern. There is the iron. That is why Dantioch matters to the Silver Skull's question. He is not evidenced by proximity or color or some childish obsession with iconography. He is evidence in the older and harder sense. He proves that the blood of the Fourth Legion could remain loyal without ceasing to be itself. He shows that a son of Perturabo might reject Horus, while retaining all the martial instincts that made the Iron Warriors what they were. Siegecraft, attrition logic, technical excellence, a soul scarred by bitterness, yet not delivered into treason. If one seeks a precedent for loyalist inheritance hidden beneath later orthodoxy, Dantioch is not a side note. He is the cornerstone that keeps the whole possibility from collapsing under accusation of absurdity. His path did not end in isolation either. Fate, or whatever cruel geometry governs the collisions of loyal men in civil war, drew him into the orbit of Ultramar. On Sotha, he aided the Ultramarines in understanding the Xenos structure beneath Mount Pharos, and through that labor, he became central to the desperate political and strategic construct, later known as Imperium Secundus. It was Dantioch's activation and mastery of the Pharos that helped loyalist forces and refugees find their way through the ruin storm to Macraga, a contribution of such scale that it touched Guilliman's entire war effort. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Dantioch was not merely a loyalist survivor from a damned legion skulking in the margins. He became useful to Guilliman himself, useful to Ultramar's provisional empire, useful at exactly the moment when utility and legitimacy were being reforged in the fires of disaster. And then there is Alexis Pollux, because some bonds tell us more than doctrine ever can. Dantioch's alliance with the Imperial Fist's commander did not arise from sentimentality or from the childish fiction that old hatreds are washed away by common cause. The Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fists were enemies in temperament as much as in war, mirrors that despised each other for being too alike in all the wrong ways. Yet Dantioch and Pollux found common ground, first through necessity and then through something sterner and rarer, respect earned under pressure. Pollux overcame his reflexive hatred of the Iron Warriors because Dantioch gave him no room to cling to caricature. Here stood a son of Perturabo who embodied the best of siegecraft without the rot of treachery, and in the furnace of Imperium Secundus that truth mattered. Dantioch's death on Sotha, slain in the battle against the Night Lords after overloading the Pharos to thwart them, ended with Pollux mourning him not as a curiosity, but as a brother won the hard way. Even in death, he remained woven into the loyalist war effort at the highest and most symbolically charged level. So when one asks whether a loyalist Iron Warrior's legacy could have been preserved quietly, folded into later structures, shielded by politics, buried beneath cleaner parchment and more acceptable heraldry, it is Dantioch who makes the question feel less like madness and more like the kind of truth the Imperium would lock away for the sake of its own balance. Not because he personally founded every later mystery, that would be too crude and too easy, but because his life demonstrates the exact combination that makes such preservation plausible. He was loyal beyond dispute. He was useful to Guilliman's strategic project. He stood in ultramarine orbit during the Heresy's most unstable hours. He carried the blood of the Fourth Legion without succumbing to the Fourth Legion's damnation. If any lineage of that sort were to be retained, disguised, politically managed, or quietly redirected into a more acceptable future, the shadow of Dantioch would loom over the process, whether named or not. That is the final reframing required before this road can continue. Barabas Dantioch is not merely a heroic exception, polished for the comfort of later ages. He is not an anecdote, proving that history occasionally permits one noble outlier before returning to its preferred simplicity. He is proof of something far more corrosive to imperial neatness. He is proof that the blood of the Fourth Legion did not all rot. Sotha is where Barabas Dantioch ceased to be merely a loyalist survivor and became something far more troublesome to clean imperial memory. Before Sotha, he could still be held within the mind as an exception, a stubborn shard of the Fourth Legion that refused to turn when the rest of the blade twisted toward treason. Before Sotha, he was a proof of loyalty under pressure, yes, but still a living warrior, still a man of armor and breath, and immediate usefulness. At Sotha, That changes. There his story ends in flesh, and his myth begins in inheritance. There, in the shadow of the Pharos, the question ceases to be what Dantioch did and becomes what survived him. To understand why that world matters, one must first understand the Pharos itself, not as a relic to be admired by the devout, but as a strategic instrument so important that its existence could alter the shape of a civil war. The Pharos was no mere beacon lantern hung in the dark by grateful settlers. It was an ancient Xenos construct buried beneath Mount Pharos on Sotha, a machine of impossible significance that functioned as both a vast signal and a guide through the madness of the ruin storm. In the age of Imperium Secundus, when the galaxy had been hacked apart by warp storms and isolation, the Pharos gave the Loyalists something rarer than hope. It gave them orientation. Through it, refugees, fleets, and warriors of the Emperor could find their way to Macraga and to the fragile order Guilliman was trying to build amidst the collapse. Dantioch mattered there because he was not simply present, he was central. He was the one who helped activate, understand, and defend the device that held Imperium Secundus together. That importance is easy to understate if one looks only at individual heroism and not at strategic consequence. The Pharos was the hidden nerve of a provisional empire. Cut the nerve, and the body convulses. Seize the beacon, and the fragile cohesion of Loyalist resistance in Ultramar becomes vulnerable to panic, blindness, and piecemeal destruction. This is why the Night Lords came for Sotha. They did not descend there merely to defile another world for sport, though they delighted in cruelty well enough. They came because the Pharos was worth more than the blood spilled to take it. It was the key instrument in maintaining the cohesion of Imperium Secundus, and thus a target whose value reached far beyond the farmers, garrisons, and stone of Sotha itself. In such a place, Dantioch was not simply another Astartes commander. He was a warden of the hinge on which an entire Loyalist project turned. And there, as ever, fate denied the lazy version of history. Dantioch did not survive Sotha. He did not walk out of legend into some secret founding chamber where grateful hands might place a new chapter standard in his grip. He did not vanish into the parchment fog with a handful of chosen veterans and a box of gene seed, conveniently positioned to father a later bloodline in the simplistic way lesser theorists prefer. At Sotha, he dies, and that death matters immensely because it closes one door while opening another. During the battle, the Night Lords sought control of the Pharos. Dantioch's answer was not retreat, nor surrender, nor some melodramatic final stand for the sake of noble phrasing. He overloaded the Pharos to deny it to the enemy, and in so doing thwarted the Night Lords at the cost of his own life. His end was sacrifice, not escape. That alone weakens the vulgar form of the theory that would make him a direct founder of whatever later mystery one wishes to force upon the setting. His flesh does not survive to perform such neat duties. His legacy must work by subtler means, or not at all. That is the necessary pivot. Legacies do not require the founder to survive. In the Imperium, almost nothing of consequence survives by living continuity alone. Legions die and become chapters. Chapters die and become myths. Names are forgotten while doctrines endure. Relics outlive meanings. Oaths persist after those who swore them have become dust, trapped in the cracks of sepulchral stone. Imperial history is full of inheritance without understanding, of rites maintained long after their origin has been locked away or misremembered. So when Dantioch dies at Sotha, the serious mind does not ask whether the trail ends. It asks how many trails begin. One of those trails is not hidden at all. This is the point many clumsy theorists miss, and because they miss it, they cheapen the entire question. The clearest and most explicit inheritance of Dantioch in later imperial history belongs not to the silver skulls, but to the scythes of the Emperor. That fact does not weaken the matter, it sharpens it. The scythes trace their roots to the defenders of Sotha, to the warriors bound to the world, and the pharaohs in the aftermath of the heresy. Dantioch's memory was not cast away there. It was formalized, preserved, incorporated into a tradition with enough clarity that even the Imperium's ruins could not wholly erase it. Guilliman himself recognized Dantioch as the first warden of the Pharos and a hero of the Imperium. That honor did not vanish into pious mist. It hardened into custom. Most striking of all is the mask. Dantioch's iron mask, that grim and memorable piece of his war panoply, did not simply rot in a tomb or disappear into the anonymous holdings of some Martian reliquary. It remained associated with the Pharos and with those who inherited the duty of guarding what Sotha concealed. In time, it became a scythes of the Emperor relic and the badge of office for the chapter master, a symbol of command tied directly to Dantioch's sacrifice and station as warden of the Pharos. This is not vague thematic resonance. It is explicit inheritance. It is the sort of legacy imperial institutions adore because it is visible, ceremonial, and capable of being sanctified without destabilizing broader myths. Here is Dantioch remembered not as a seed of genealogical discomfort, but as a martyr warden whose relic can be borne openly by an unquestionably loyal chapter. And that is precisely why the Silver Skulls remain interesting. Because they are not the obvious Dantioch chapter. If anything, the open line of memory runs elsewhere, toward Sotha, toward the scythes, toward the mask raised in plain sight as a relic of office. That is where the Imperium points, if asked where Dantioch's visible legacy endured. That is the public shrine. That is the clean answer. And because it is so clean, because the most overt and ceremonial continuation of his memory has somewhere respectable to live, the deeper and more dangerous question is easier to ignore. Public symbols are excellent camouflage. A relic enthroned in one lineage can distract from quieter survivals in another. Once memory has been given an altar, fewer eyes go searching the vault beneath the altar floor. This is where the legacy forks. On one path lies symbol, honor, a named continuity of office and relic. The scythes of the Emperor can take Dantioch's mask, bind it to their own command tradition, and preserve him in a mode the Imperium understands, as an exceptional hero whose loyalty was proven, whose sacrifice was sanctified, whose memory can be held in the open because it threatens nothing by itself. Such a legacy is manageable. It is public enough to satisfy reverence and narrow enough to prevent contagion of uncomfortable thought. It says, "Here was a loyalist from a damned legion. Yes, but he died well. We remembered him properly, and his burden passed into a chapter whose line presents no catastrophic challenge to the accepted order." A relic can do that. A relic can absorb dangerous history and return it to the Imperium as pageantry. On the other path lies blood, not named, not displayed, not worn ceremonially over the brow of a chapter master before admiring battle brothers and dutiful serfs. Blood does not need to announce itself. It only needs to persist. If any quieter inheritance of Dantioch's kind, or of Loyalist 4th Legion stock more broadly, endured elsewhere, it would not do so through a relic all could point to. It would do so by vanishing into the long administrative violence of the post-heresy age, absorbed into new designations, sealed beneath more acceptable paperwork, filed under cleaner ancestry, shielded by the exact kind of institutional silence that preserves useful truths by refusing to name them honestly. In that model, the scythes receive the public relic, while another chapter, perhaps far less obviously tied to Sotha, receives something more dangerous to admit. Not the mask, the inheritance. This is why Sotha matters so much to the Silver Skulls question, even though the obvious line from Dantioch runs elsewhere. If the Silver Skulls had inherited Dantioch in some blatant and ceremonial fashion, there would be little mystery worth respecting. The matter would already be loud, already processed, already contained within open remembrance. Instead, the most visible legacy is housed in one place, which leaves room for the suspicion that another, quieter legacy may have slipped elsewhere beneath the grindstone of 10,000 years. One branch becomes the approved story, the relic, the badge, the litany. The other, if it exists at all, becomes the sort of blood truth the Imperium cannot abolish without losing a useful weapon, and cannot acknowledge without inviting a more dangerous reckoning. So the road divides at Sotha and does not rejoin. One legacy becomes public symbol. Another may yet have become hidden bloodline. Of all the loyal chapters in all the Emperor's realm, why does suspicion coil so readily around the Silver Skulls? Why them? Why not some other stern brotherhood of distant founding, some other company of gene-forged killers whose records are old, whose customs are strange, whose dead are honored in ways that would chill the hearts of softer men? Why does the eye keep sliding back to these warriors in silver plate, to these skull-marked sons of war, as though some old instinct in the reading of Imperial history refuses to let the matter rest? The answer begins, as dangerous answers so often do, with appearances. One does not build a case from appearances alone. That would be the work of fools, of shrine corner gossips and underhive lunatics who mistake a painted pauldron for revelation. Yet one must begin where the eye begins, and the Silver Skulls are a chapter built to provoke the eye. Their heraldry is not merely martial, it is sepulchral. Their badge is a silvered skull borne openly upon warplate already greyed like old. Iron in the light of a dead sun. Even before a single archive seal is broken, even before a single gene vault notation is scrutinized, they present themselves to the imagination as something colder than many of the more polished airs of Ultramar. They do not look like the bright civic ideal that clings, fairly or not, to the nobler legends of Guilliman's line. They look harder, bleaker, less like exemplars carved for triumphal arches, more like executioners dragged from some fortress crypt where old campaigns are counted in bones rather than banners. Their own culture deepens that impression, for they silver the skulls of worthy foes and display them as trophies within their fortress monastery, binding death into ritual instead of merely passing through it on the way to cleaner honors. That matters, though not in the childish way some would prefer. A skull is not proof of Iron Warrior's blood. In the 41st millennium, skulls are as common as prayer, and no serious mind should pretend otherwise. The Imperium heaps death symbols upon everything it loves. Shrines are crowned with skulls, banners are fringed with skulls, reliquaries, armor trim, altar rails, vault doors, throne halls, and execution grounds all wear the same face of mortality until the whole species seems to worship its own remains. If one were to accuse every skull-marked institution of hidden descent from some particular old legion, the galaxy would drown in nonsense by the next dawn. Iconography proves nothing by itself. Color proves nothing by itself. A silver skull on a pauldron is not a confession. It is not even evidence in the strictest sense. It is an invitation to notice, nothing more. But appearances have their power, because they shape instinct faster than parchment ever can. Men see before they verify. They feel before they conclude. They build suspicions from silhouettes and temperament long before they lay a trembling hand upon the sealed record itself. That is not a virtue, but neither is it avoidable. And the Silver Skulls, by appearance alone, do not project the same emotional image as many other ultramarine descended chapters. They are not coded in the mind as blue nobility, civic soldiery, ordered grandeur, or the stern but luminous inheritance of Macraga. They are coded as something more funereal, more severe, more pitiless. Their visual language speaks not of the forum and the fortress in balance, but of the tomb, the bastion, the skull rack, the killing ground, the iron necessity of victory. Whether that instinct is fair is another matter. What matters first is that the instinct exists at all. Then one moves beyond appearance, and the theory becomes more dangerous because the imagery begins to align with function. The Silver Skulls are, by the approved record, broad
to Guilliman's tactical order in the main, yet the same record is plain that they possess a marked specialization in siege warfare, and that this tendency is not some vague battlefield preference, but a real enough institutional trait to stand out amid their otherwise codified structure. Their tactics are described as relentless, efficient, and extremely pragmatic, untroubled by purity of style so long as victory is achieved. Even their melee reputation carries a note of barbaric brutality, as though beneath all the ordered discipline there lurks a willingness to close with the enemy in ways less ornamental and more ruinous than some of their cousins might favor. Their Ninth Company itself is altered from the more ordinary reserve role into a designated siege company, led by a siege captain, which tells its own quiet story about what the chapter prizes and where it expects to spend blood. There, at last, the iron taste enters the mouth, because siege war is not merely a battlefield preference, it is a philosophy of pressure. It is the art of reducing resistance by method, attrition, geometry, labor, patience, and disciplined cruelty. It is not unique to the Fourth Legion, no more than marksmanship is unique to one chapter, or fury to another. Many loyal sons of the Imperium know how to break walls. Many chapters have ground themselves against fortresses and hive cities until the rubble itself became a second enemy. But when a chapter already draped in silver and skull imagery, already marked by sepulchral ritual, already shadowed by unease in the blood records, also displays a notable institutional affinity for siege.
Warfare, the visual suspicion, gains muscle. The old instinct that first stirred at heraldry now finds doctrine waiting behind the door. Still, even that is not enough. It is not enough because the Imperium is full of convergences. Cultures overlap. Martial traditions echo one another. A chapter may resemble another in one aspect, or 5 aspects, and still possess an entirely different inheritance beneath the skin. To mistake resemblance for verdict is to become unfit for serious historical thought. A clue is not a chain. A pattern is not a sentence. The silver skulls do not attract the Iron Warrior's suspicion simply because they wear a skull and favor sieges. If that were all, the theory would deserve the contempt of any disciplined mind. What deepens the matter is temperament. Read the approved descriptions of how they wage war. Relentless, efficient, extremely pragmatic, not adverse to whatever tactics prove necessary. Even in official phrasing, one hears not the rhetoric of knightly splendor, but the language of utility sharpened to a military edge. This is not the vocabulary of a chapter eager to be loved. It is the vocabulary of a chapter made to function. Add to this their fearsome post-battle rites, the silvering of enemy skulls, the harsh tribal imprint of Varavia, and their reputation as headhunters, and the whole image darkens further. Not into corruption, not into heresy, but into a martial identity that many eyes, rightly or wrongly, read as iron rather than blue. Less patrician, less ceremonially noble, more like a weapon forged for ugly necessity and left unpolished because only fools confuse shine with virtue. That reading is interpretive, and it must remain so. One should be honest enough to admit it. The record does not say, "Here is a chapter that feels like a buried echo of the Fourth Legion." The record says something cooler and more disciplined. It gives tactics, structure, customs, and the hard facts of deployment. The sensation that the silver skulls project a colder and more functional martial soul than many of Guilliman's other heirs is born in the act of synthesis. It arises when heraldry, ritual, and battlefield profile are viewed together. That is why symbolism builds theories faster than archives. The archive gives fragments. Symbolism teaches the mind how to assemble them into a shape, even if that shape must later be tested and corrected by sterner means. This is where lesser arguments tend to fail. They seize upon the skull badge and silver armor as if the case ends there, as if paint were destiny. It is not. The badge is not compelling because it is a skull. It is compelling because it fits a wider pattern already made uneasy by other facts. The siege specialization matters. The relentless pragmatism matters. The reshaped Ninth Company matters. The chapter's severe and death-haunted ritual identity matters. Most of all, the broader anxiety around their blood records matters, because iconography is only dangerous when it begins to rhyme with archival discomfort. A silver skull on a cleanly documented and emotionally uncomplicated chapter would remain only a silver skull. Here it lands upon old pressure lines. Here it seems almost too apt, which is not proof, but is certainly fuel. Add to this the wider frame of legitimacy, and the tension sharpens again. The silver skulls are not some isolated oddity beyond the concern of greater Imperial myth. They are counted among the shield chapters of Ultramar, one of the chapters charged by Guilliman with defending the realm of Ultramar itself, and the record further notes that they claim descent from the Ultramarines, behave as a Codex chapter, and were recognized among the scions of Guilliman after the Primarch's return. That is the posture in which all these harsher impressions become explosive. If such severity belonged to a more remote and symbolically irrelevant chapter, it might remain no more than local character. But here the grim profile is nested inside ultramarine legitimacy, and that tension is exactly what makes suspicious minds linger. So let the distinction be made with proper discipline. These things are clues, not verdicts. They are indicators, not confessions. Silver armor does not condemn. Skull imagery does not reveal. Siegecraft does not prove blood. Grim functionality does not by itself drag a chapter into the shadow of Perturabo. Yet when all of these elements gather around a chapter whose lineage already carries the chill of overprotected records and uneasy conclusions, suspicion begins to mature. What first appeared as mere visual coincidence starts to take on structure. Not certainty, not official revelation, but structure. And that is the threshold crossed here. This is the point at which the Silver Skulls cease to be merely a chapter with ominous heraldry and become a chapter whose aesthetics, doctrine, and temperament combine into something more substantial than coincidence. The suspicion is no longer born only of what the eye sees on a pauldron. It begins, at last, to feel thematically plausible. There is a childish habit in the reading of old bloodlines, and it has ruined more serious arguments than any censor ever could. It is the habit of expecting dissent to behave like a mirror. Men seize upon a suspected lineage and then demand that every custom, every ritual, every battle cry, every little superstition, and every mark of heraldry must align in perfect obedience with the ancient source. If it does not, they declare the theory dead and congratulate themselves on their discipline. But blood does not preserve culture with such mechanical purity. The Adeptus Astartes are not formed in a void. They are not jars of gene seed stacked upon a shelf somewhere in the dark beneath Terra, each one forever producing the same kind of warrior in the same shape of soul. They are raised on worlds. They are broken by local suns, local dead, local gods half-remembered and forcibly renamed, local rites, local fears, local winters, local humiliations. They inherit the flesh of their Primarch, yes, but they also inherit the dirt beneath their boots, the language of the tribes that fed them, the funerary customs of those who knelt over their childhood dead long before they ever heard the words Codex Astartes spoken in a chapel of war. So if one would be honest about the Silver Skulls, one must let Varavia enter the chamber. That world matters more than the careless suspect prefers. Varavia is no incidental recruiting ground, no nameless stockyard of flesh from which the chapter hauls bodies and leaves no imprint in return. It has shaped them. Its fierce tribes, its ancestral devotions, its old bone-deep ways of honoring the dead and marking the worthy, have entered the chapter so completely that any attempt to speak of the Silver Skulls as though they were merely unfiltered descendants of some older legion becomes laughably thin. They recruit from a people already tempered by hardness, already bound to their ancestors with a closeness that many more urban and ceremonially polished chapters would regard as primitive, were they not wise enough to recognize usefulness when it bares its teeth. The young of Varavia do not come into the chapter as blank vessels. They bring with them inherited fears, inherited pride, inherited violence, and inherited modes of reverence. The Silver Skulls took those things, and as chapters always do, forged them into something larger and harsher. What emerged was not Macragge in miniature. It was a brotherhood marked by its world. H40klexicanum.com, https://h40klexicanum.com, wiki, Silver Skulls, UTM, source, chatgpt.com. That is why their funerary customs matter, and why they complicate the theory rather than solving it. The Silver Skulls are notorious for their reverence toward the dead, not as a clean and abstract veneration rendered from a distance, but as something tactile, close, and edged with the old savagery of trophy and warning. They honor ancestors. They preserve memory in ways that feel older than the polished civic virtues associated with the more idealized legends of Ultramar. They silver the skulls of especially worthy foes and bear them back as trophies, acts that strike many Imperial observers as grisly even by Astartes standards, though few would be foolish enough to say so within earshot of the chapter itself. Their fortress is not merely a redoubt of ceramite, stone, and litany. It is a house of bones, a vault of conquered death given ritual form. Their reputation as headhunters is no empty flourish. It comes from practices rooted in a culture that sees the dead as speaking presences, as burdens and honors, as warnings, inheritances, and proofs of triumph all at once. H40k.lexicanum.com, https://h40klexicanum.com, wiki, Silver Skulls, UTM, source, chatgpt.com. Now look at that clearly. It is terrifying. It is severe. It is exactly the kind of detail that makes suspicious minds begin drawing iron lines through silver plate. And yet it is not, in any clean sense, inherently iron warriors in origin. That is the crucial restraint. Trophy skulls, ancestor rites, bone reverence, the keeping of enemy remains as ritual objects, these things belong first to Varavia and to the chapter culture shaped there. They are local in flavor, even when transhuman in execution. They do not arise naturally from the popular image of the Fourth Legion, any more than they arise from the civic myth of Ultramar. They are their own thing, born of tribal custom, and then fed through centuries of Astartes institutionalization, until they became the Silver Skulls, as they are known now. Anyone who would flatten such practices into simple proof of Iron Warrior's descent is not reading the chapter. He is merely forcing it to confess to a story he already prefers. And then there are the prognosticators. Here, at last, the matter grows stranger in a more serious way, because the prognosticators are not merely ornament. They are not some isolated librarious eccentricity tolerated on ceremonial days and ignored when war truly begins. They sit close to the chapter's inner life. Their portents are treated with a seriousness that reaches into command, into deployment, into the very shape of how the Silver Skulls choose their wars and commit their strength. The chapter does not merely maintain a few seers in the manner of many Adeptus Astartes brotherhoods. It grants prophecy unusual centrality. The prognosticators read the currents of fate as the chapter understands them, and the chapter listens. Decisions bend around foresight. Strategy is informed by omen. The Silvered Skull and the Augur's vision stand nearer to one another here than they do in most chapters that lay claim to strict orthodoxy. wh40k.lexicanum.com, https://wh40k.lexicanum.com/wiki/silver_skulls UTM_source = chat gpt.com. This should give pause to anyone attempting to make the Silver Skulls into a simple continuation of the Fourth Legion under a cleaner name. The common image of the Iron Warriors however incomplete, is of warriors who trust the visible, the measurable, the structural, the brutal arithmetic of siege and fire. Builders, breakers, engineers of death, yes, but not a legion popularly remembered for centering prophecy in the chain of command. They are associated in the mind with bastions, artillery, endurance, attrition, cynicism, and the uglier mathematics of war. Even where superstition and corruption later gnawed at them, they are still remembered first as makers of hard logic turned toward remorseless ends.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The Silver Skulls complicate that image profoundly. Whatever iron may or may not lie beneath them, their living culture is not one of pure materialist siegecraft. It is shot through with omen, ancestral memory, tribal inheritance, and a chapter-sanctioned deference to vision. And that complication is not a weakness in the theory. It is one of the strongest reasons to take the theory seriously without letting it become stupid. For if the Silver Skulls do carry blood that once ran in the Fourth Legion, then the lesson is not that blood remains unchanged. The lesson is that blood can endure while culture transforms almost beyond recognition. That is how chapters actually live across the abyss of millennia. They are layered things. Gene seed at the core, perhaps, but over that core is wound the entire history of a homeworld, the rites of recruitment, the scars of near extinction, the selective pressure of certain campaigns repeated over and over until they become doctrine, the influence of particular commanders, the accidents of relic inheritance, the theological interpretations of successive chaplains, the tolerated superstitions of the librarius, and the raw fact that warriors who survive terrible centuries tend to shape their descendants more decisively than any parchment genealogy ever could. A chapter can begin in one truth and live long enough to become several others. Wait 40k at lexicanum.com, https UH40k, lexicanum.com, wiki, Silver Skulls, UTM, source, chatgpt.com. That is why Varavia must not be treated as noise. It is not noise. It is the medium through which the Silver Skulls became themselves. The fierce tribes of that world, their ancestor worship, their grim reverence for skulls, their reading of death as meaning rather than simple cessation, all of it entered the chapter and altered its face. Add to that the prognosticators, whose role is so unusual and so central that they tug the chapter further from any crude expectation of a direct Iron Warrior's cultural echo, and one sees the proper shape of the problem. If the Silver Skulls are connected to the Fourth Legion at all, they are not a preserved museum specimen. They are not old iron in a glass case. They are something older buried beneath much newer things, beneath Varavia, beneath ritual bonework, beneath prophetic command habits, beneath the accumulated identity of a chapter that has had too long to become its own species of loyalist monster. In that light, even the chapter's reputation as headhunters must be read with discipline. It is frightening, yes. It suits the sepulchral image that first draws suspicion, yes. But it is not automatically a signpost pointing toward Perturabo's sons. It is better understood as one more expression of a death-haunted Varsavian martial culture taken into Astartes' hands and magnified into something transhumanly grim. The Iron Warrior's comparison enters only when this local savagery is placed beside the chapter's siege aptitude, its colder and more functional battlefield manner, and the unease hanging over its blood records. Alone, the headhunter image proves little. In company with those other elements, it becomes part of a wider pattern. There is the needed distinction again, not verdict, pattern, and patterns in the Imperium must always be read through time. 10,000 years is more than enough to bury a bloodline beneath new names, new rights, new convictions, and new fears. It is enough time for warriors to forget what their earliest founders would have considered essential, and instead cling with absolute sincerity to customs that would have seemed alien to those forebears. It is enough time for a chapter to become loyal in one fashion, savage in another, ritualistic in a third, and entirely unable to disentangle which part of itself came from primarchal inheritance and which from the world that taught its recruits to look upon skulls as vessels of memory. It is enough time, in short, for new identity to grow over old blood like cathedral stone laid atop a buried fortress. So the question must now be framed properly, or not at all. The question is not whether the silver skulls look exactly like the Fourth Legion. They do not. Varavia alone forbids so lazy a conclusion, and the prognosticators drive the wedge deeper. The question is whether buried blood can survive beneath layers of new identity, so thick, so fiercely lived, and so sanctified by time, that even the warriors who bear it would no longer recognize the depth at which the old iron still endures. If one were forced to choose a single feature within the silver skulls that most stubbornly resists dismissal, a single point where suspicion ceases to be merely aesthetic and starts to harden into institutional shape, it would not be the silver of their plate, nor the grinning death mask of their heraldry, nor even the sealed unease in their blood records taken by themselves. It would be structure. It would be the way the chapter has arranged itself for war. This matters because organization is harder to fake than symbolism. A badge may be chosen, a color may be inherited, revised, sanctified, or misunderstood. A trophy right may rise from a homeworld's tribal marrow and become holy through repetition. But structure is where preference becomes law. Structure is where instinct survives long after words have been cleaned, revised, or buried. A chapter arranges itself according to what it believes war truly is, not what it claims in ceremony, not what some archivist writes in optimistic script, what it actually prepares to do over and over again when the void opens and the guns begin. The silver skulls are, in the broad and official sense, a codex-shaped chapter. That much is plain enough in the sanctioned record. They are not some wild and fragmented brotherhood that has abandoned Guilliman's military order in favor of pure tribal ferocity or local improvisation. Their companies, command culture, and outward doctrine still stand recognizably within the frame laid down by the Codex Astartes, the great architecture of post-heresy chapter war. That is part of why they have remained so publicly acceptable within the ultramarine sphere. They look correct from a distance. They march in ordered companies. They present as disciplined heirs to a known and trusted martial inheritance, but only broadly, only primarily. And in the Imperium, where orthodoxy lives and dies in the details, the word broadly can hide a cathedral of dangerous meaning. For the silver skulls do not follow the codex perfectly. Their ninth company has not remained what a more rigidly conventional chapter would expect it to be. Instead of serving as a reserve devastator company in the standard pattern, it has been altered into a designated siege company, and its captain bears the title of siege captain. That is not a decorative flourish. That is not some minor affectation tucked harmlessly into the chapter rolls for local color. It is an official institutional deviation, explicit enough to be named, pointed enough to demand interpretation. Pause there and feel the weight of it properly. A supposedly orthodox ultramarine successor does not make such a change without meaning. The Codex is not holy merely because Guilliman wrote it. It is holy because it became the grammar through which the Adeptus Astartes learned to survive the age after the legions. To alter one of its reserve companies into a permanent siege formation is to confess a long habit of thought. It says that this chapter does not merely know how to prosecute sieges when required, as any worthy Astartes force must. It says the chapter expects siege war. It prepares for siege war. It reserves strength for siege war in a way significant enough to reshape the internal skeleton of the Brotherhood itself. That is no battlefield accident. That is preference hardened into institution. And that, more than heraldry, is where old instinct tends to survive. A chapter can polish its public image until outsiders see only loyalty, dignity, and approved dissent. It can absorb the customs of a homeworld until tribal rights seem more important than any ancient genetic inheritance. It can pray differently, trophy its dead differently, speak differently, and remember differently, but its company structure reveals what kind of war it has chosen to become. The shape of a chapter is a confession written in deployment logic. When the Silver Skulls transform the Ninth Company into a siege company, they are telling the galaxy something far more intimate than any skull badge ever could. They are saying that one of the chapter's enduring strategic identities lies in siegecraft, breaching doctrine, attritional pressure, and the long, merciless labor of breaking fortified resistance. This is why the Iron Warrior's echo feels loudest here. Not because siege warfare belongs only to the sons of Perturabo. It does not. That must be said with full discipline, because without that discipline, this entire inquiry rots into sensationalism. The Imperium has no shortage of fortress breakers, hive reducers, trench line butchers, and city killers. Countless chapters know how to prosecute sieges. Countless commanders have learned to read walls, void shields, ammunition curves, breach geometry, and the psychology of enclosed defenders. Siege war is a universal language in a galaxy built from citadels and mass graves. To hear the Fourth Legion in every bombardment would be idiocy, yet some echoes remain more resonant than others. The Silver Skulls do not merely possess siege capability, they have chosen to embody it structurally. They have taken what in many chapters would remain a tactical competency and enthroned it as a dedicated company identity. That makes the matter more than circumstantial. It suggests long-term institutional preference, the kind that often survives because it works, because it feels natural to the warrior breed sustaining it, because generation after generation of officers inherits not only formal doctrine, but a tacit sense of where the chapter is strongest and most itself. You do not keep a siege company because of one memorable campaign. You keep it because the chapter keeps returning to that mode of war and continues to believe it reflects some core truth about what it was made to do. The point sharpens further when placed against the larger profile already established. Here is a chapter whose silvered death imagery encourages sepulchral readings. Here is a chapter whose culture, though deeply marked by Varavia, still projects severity, trophy-taking, grim functionality, and cold utility in war. Here is a chapter whose records do not sit comfortably in the clear light one would expect of a bloodline so publicly accepted. And here, nested inside, that whole atmosphere of unease is a formal siege company where a reserve devastator company should have been. The pattern does not prove, but it does accumulate, and accumulation is how real suspicion survives in the Imperium, not by one glorious revelation, but by many small pieces that refuse to stop pointing in the same direction. This is also where one sees the difference between thematic plausibility and empty coincidence. If the Silver Skulls had only the skull badge, the theory would be weak. If they had only the blood record problem, the theory would be interesting, but abstract. If they had only a reputation for siege competence, the matter would remain broad enough to fit 100 Loyalist interpretations. But when the chapter's organizational body itself is altered to preserve siege identity as a standing fact of its existence, then the old question returns with greater force. Why this emphasis? Why this permanence? Why this particular adaptation within a chapter so otherwise comfortable, wearing the outward plate of ultramarine orthodoxy? One possible answer, of course, is simple utility born of circumstance. The Silver Skulls have fought in hard theaters. They have served in ugly frontier wars. They have endured campaigns where stubborn defenses, entrenched resistance, and punishing attrition rewarded siege-minded preparation. Any chapter repeatedly blooded in such wars might develop specialist habits. Any institution that survives long enough tends to adapt to the burdens placed upon it. That counterpoint is fair, and it must remain in the chamber. A serious argument survives by acknowledging the strongest innocent explanation before reaching for darker conclusions. But even that counterpoint has limits, because battlefield adaptation alone does not always produce formal reorganization. Many chapters become renowned for certain tactics without rewriting the role of an entire company around them. The step from proficiency to structural designation is meaningful. It implies that siegecraft is not merely one specialty among many, but something central enough to deserve permanent place, permanent title, permanent continuity. The office of siege captain is especially telling in this regard. Titles matter in the Adeptus Astartes. They preserve memory. They encode value. Once a role acquires a name, the chapter has admitted that the function it names is no passing convenience, but part of how the Brotherhood understands itself. That is why structure can preserve old instinct better than heraldry ever will. Heraldry addresses the eye. Structure addresses the hand. A warrior can wear symbols he did not choose and repeat litanies whose first authors are lost to ash. But he fights according to the institutions that shaped him, and those institutions often carry older loyalties of temperament than any banner can confess. A chapter descended from one line may come to speak like another, pray like a third, recruit from a fourth, and yet still reveal some ancestral preference in the kinds of war it prepares for most deeply. If buried blood leaves traces anywhere after millennia of reinvention, it is often in those habits of force that become too useful to surrender. So no, siege specialization is not exclusive to the 4th Legion. But when siege identity is this explicit, this formalized, and this closely stacked atop the Silver Skull's larger record anxiety, the whole picture becomes harder to dismiss with a shrug. The siege company does not convict them. It does something more dangerous. It gives behavior to the suspicion. It moves the argument from looks to institutional habit, from symbolic resonance to repeatable martial preference. And that makes it, at least so far, the strongest clue of all. A chapter's blood may be sealed. Its heraldry may be polished into sanctified simplicity. Its founding myth may be spoken with the same patient confidence by 10,000 serfs, 10,000 priests, 10,000 functionaries who have never once laid ungloved hands upon the deeper record. But campaign history is harder to bridle. War leaves habits in the flesh. It teaches a brotherhood what kind of killers it truly is. Not what it claims in liturgy, not what it paints upon parchment. What it becomes, deployment after deployment, in the places where ammunition fails, allies die, and the only truths that matter are those still standing after the bombardment ends. So if one wishes to understand the Silver Skulls beyond genealogy, one must ask a simpler and in some ways harsher question. What kind of war do they wage? Not what line they are said to descend from. Not what old suspicion clings to their blood. What kind of war keeps calling their name? What kind of war they are sent to prosecute when the Imperium has no need of pageantry, no patience for shining legends, and no use for chapters that require clean battlefields in order to look glorious? The answer matters, because war reveals preferences no archive clerk can fully conceal. It reveals where a chapter is comfortable. It reveals the shape of its instinct. The Silver Skulls do not belong chiefly to the bright and ornamental strain of Imperial legend. They are not remembered as radiant crusaders descending in splendor upon grateful worlds, while banners ripple and crowds weep in relief. That mode of myth exists elsewhere, and even where it is false, it at least flatters. The Silver Skulls are harder to flatter. Their known record places them instead in the sort of campaigns that grind beauty into ash. Attritional wars, siege wars, frontier wars, suppression wars. The kinds of theaters where endurance matters more than theater, and victory is measured not by how magnificently it was won, but by whether enough of the enemy died before one's own strength bled out into the dirt. Armageddon alone should sharpen the point. To speak that world's name is to summon one of the Imperium's great furnaces, a place so drenched in war that it ceased long ago to resemble an ordinary planet and became instead a standing wound in the flesh of the Imperium. Ash wastes, hive bastions, trench networks, refinery cathedrals, iron plains choked with smoke and shell fire, the whole world a shrine to industrial slaughter. Chapters sent there are not indulged, they are spent. Whatever romantic delusions a warrior might carry into other campaigns are burned out of him on Armageddon. There is only attrition, stubbornness, siege pressure, counter-assault, and the ugly arithmetic of holding ground that no living thing should wish to stand upon. That the Silver Skulls fought there places them immediately within a category of chapter experience that is neither decorative nor incidental. Armageddon is not a campaign one remembers for elegance. It is where iron habits are forged or broken. And if Armageddon were an isolated stain upon their history, one might leave it at that. But it is not. The Gildar Rift follows, and with it the same operational taste for ugly duty in places too thankless to produce heroes fit for easy Imperial iconography. The Rift was not the kind of theatre around which the Imperium builds a clean myth of shining deliverance. It was a hard place, a cruel place, the sort of region where a chapter is not admired for noble posture so much as relied upon to endure the relentless abrasion of hostile space and stubborn resistance. There is a difference between a glorious crusade and grinding duty in a strategically hateful sector. The Silver Skulls belong more naturally to the latter category. They appear again and again in places where war becomes labor, where lines must be held until they fossilize, where any triumph worth naming has first been paid for in stacked dead and crippled armor. Then there are the wars nearer Varavia, where the matter becomes even more revealing. A chapter shaped by frontier pressure becomes a different kind of predator. That is one of the oldest truths of Imperial military history. It is easy enough to speak of chapters in abstract terms, as if each exists in ceremonial isolation from the particular enemies and burdens that gnaw at its home sphere. But frontier chapters do not enjoy that luxury. They are shaped by the predators nearest their own gate. For the Silver Skulls, that has meant costly conflict against raiders and revenants alike, against the swift sadism of the Dark Eldar and the cold, inhuman recurrence of the Necrons in the region surrounding Varavia. Those are not wars that reward noble simplicity. They reward vigilance, severity, pragmatism, and a willingness to answer atrocity with unblinking retaliation. They harden a chapter in very specific ways. Dark Eldar War teaches the value of brutal reprisal and disciplined readiness against an enemy that prefers terror, speed, and the desecration of the weak. Necron War teaches endurance against deathless inevitability, against foes for whom fear, fatigue, and ordinary biological cost mean nothing at all. A brotherhood blooded against both kinds of enemy becomes difficult to romanticize. It learns to fight like a lockjaw trap. This is how chapters acquire operational identity, not from one grand declaration, but from repetition, from the same forms of hardship encountered again and again until the institution itself begins to bend around them. Fight enough campaigns against fast-moving raiders, and a chapter becomes more severe in readiness. Fight enough wars of entrenched resistance and iron reclamation, and it becomes patient in the ugliest sense. Fight often enough in border zones where no aid comes swiftly, and every relief fleet seems a year too late, and soon enough one's whole culture begins to assume that war is not a matter of brilliant victory, but of surviving long enough to reduce the enemy to corpses. That is the smell of the Silver Skulls' campaign history. Not parade ground splendor, not the civic sword of Ultramar carried with polished idealism into textbook war. Something harder, colder, more punitive. The Lazar blockade reinforces that image further. There is a reason such operations cling to a chapter's reputation long after the particulars fade into half-remembered campaign cant. Blockades, suppressions, cordons, interdictions, the sort of wars where information is withheld as readily as ammunition, where severity becomes both tactic and message, where the enemy is not merely defeated, but suffocated. A chapter repeatedly associated with such actions acquires a different flavor in the mind. Not looser, not more corrupt, but more secretive in aura, more pitiless in method, more suited to those shadowed imperial tasks where there will be no cheering survivors to sing of noble rescue. One does not emerge from such service looking like a chapter of bright exemplars. One emerges looking like what the Imperium actually requires when mercy becomes strategically inconvenient. That is the Silver Skulls in campaign record. Hard-edged killers, the sort of Astartes deployed where endurance matters more than theatre, where fortresses must be broken, where dead worlds must be retained, where raiders must be hunted into extinction, where waking tombs must be sealed beneath rubble and ash, where the line cannot break because behind it there is nothing but civilians too weak to matter and worlds too strategically useful to lose. It is worth pausing here to make the necessary distinction once again. None of this proves dissent from the 4th Legion. It cannot. Campaign profile is not a blood test. Many chapters become severe through service. Many Loyalist brotherhoods are battered into attritional habits by the worlds they are ordered to defend. The Imperium is full of meat-grinder wars and bone-counting victories. It breeds grim specialists as naturally as old tombs breed dust. Yet battlefield habit may be the one place where hidden dissent leaks most reliably into the open. Because habit is less self-conscious than heraldry. It is less curated than official myth. A chapter can tell itself any number of noble things about who it is. But when pressed, when repeatedly committed to the same species of killing, some deeper preference often reveals itself. In the Silver Skulls, that preference appears again and again in the same grim key. Siege pressure, attritional defense, punitive action, endurance over spectacle, severity over flourish, utility over all comforting stories of martial beauty. That is what makes their operational history feel iron. Not because every campaign resembles the old wars of Perturabo's sons in direct line. Not because one can point to Armageddon, or the Gildar Rift, or the wars near Varsavia, and say, there is the 4th Legion reborn. Such claims would be foolish. But long exposure to the ugliest forms of war creates a certain cast of institutional soul. It teaches a chapter to privilege reduction over drama, persistence over brilliance, fortification and breach over heroic momentum. Whether by blood or by centuries of convergent survival, the Silver Skulls have become very comfortable in that mode of war, and that comfort is telling. This is a chapter made for dead worlds, for hive carcasses, for trench lines drowned in old blood, for siege walls blackened by shell impact, for frontier systems where rescue comes too late, and victory means the enemy left more corpses than you did. This is a chapter made for the kind of war where bones are the most honest tally left when the smoke clears. A chapter that can stand in such places again and again without losing itself entirely, does not come away untouched. It becomes the thing those wars require. So no, their campaign record does not prove the theory, but it keeps feeding it. At last the matter returns to the knife point, where suspicion hardens into procedure. Up to now, the Silver Skulls have been approached through the long shadows cast by heraldry, campaign habit, cultural divergence, and the old ghost of Dantioch. All of that has weight. All of that feeds the theory, but none of it equals the moment when Imperial authority itself stepped past instinct and demanded an answer from the vault. That moment matters, because the Imperium does not investigate its own angels lightly. It may spend the lives of uncounted billions with bureaucratic indifference, but it does not casually prise open the flesh history of an Astartes chapter and ask whether the blood has been named correctly. To do so is to tamper with one of the few myths still treated as both sacred and strategically necessary. The Adeptus Astartes are not merely war assets. They are lineages armed with memory. To question a chapter's origin is to question its place in that memory, and the Imperium only risks such disturbances when unease has already grown too heavy to ignore. That is where Inquisitor Leandra Callis enters this history, not as a decorative witness, but as proof that the question had escaped the realm of mutter and become an object of formal scrutiny. The records state that the Silver Skull's gene seed was investigated by the Ordo Hereticus, and that Callis herself struggled to obtain the chapter's records despite going so far as the gene vaults of Terra. Dwell on that difficulty, because it is not a minor detail. It is part of the story. In the Imperium, access is meaning. Doors do not resist without reason. Archives are not made stubborn by accident when the matters within are simple and fit for easy recital. If an inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus must wrestle with classification merely to lay eyes upon a chapter's bloodline record, then that resistance is itself a kind of testimony. A straightforward file should not behave like a sealed reliquary in the deepest crypt of a shrine world. A settled lineage should not require so much force to expose to those already empowered to see. The obstruction surrounding the Silver Skulls tells us that someone, somewhere, at some point in the long, choking bureaucracy of the Imperium, decided that access to the truth was itself dangerous, not impossible, not forbidden in the absolute sense, dangerous. Dangerous enough that even an inquisitor had to bleed time and authority just to make the archive yield. And when the file finally opened, what was found was not the kind of answer lesser minds crave. There was no obvious stain of mutation, no proven taint, no warp-touched corruption blooming in the gene line like rot in stored grain. The investigation ruled out the easy damnations. The Silver Skulls were shown to be free of taint and mutation. That should have settled the matter, if the matter had truly been one of purity alone. In any cleaner tale, that would be the end of it. The chapter would be vindicated, the suspicious silenced, the gene vault sealed once more with fresh rites and less anxiety than before. But that is not what happened. The concern remained. Worse, the concern sharpened. The problem was never merely whether the Silver Skulls were impure. The problem was that their origins, once clarified, were feared as something capable of causing schism within the chapter if the wider brotherhood learned them. There is the true wound. The Imperium can tolerate monstrous truths with a grim and practiced efficiency. It tolerates worlds ruled by terror so long as the tithe is met. It tolerates abominations in red robes so long as the engines still answer prayer and march to war. It tolerates necessary brutality on a scale that would shatter the minds of weaker civilizations before breakfast. It can even tolerate corruption for a time, provided the corruption is compartmentalized, contained, and useful enough to justify its own continued breathing. What the Imperium tolerates far less easily are destabilizing truths. Truths that do not simply identify an enemy, but force loyal institutions to reconsider themselves. Truths that slip under armor and enter identity. Truths that cannot be solved by a firing line, because the damage they do lies not in flesh, but in self-understanding. That is why the phrase feared to cause schism within the chapter strikes harder than any accusation of mutation ever could. Mutation is a known language. There are rituals for it, verdicts for it, pyres enough to answer it. But schism is subtler and more ruinous. Schism means division among the loyal. Schism means brothers reading the same blood and seeing two different destinies. Schism means a truth so difficult that it cannot be digested uniformly, even by those bred to obey, endure, and kill together. If the revelation behind the Silver Skull's records were nothing more than administrative ugliness, no such danger would exist. No battle brother would draw spiritual steel over an archived clerical discrepancy. No chapter would fear internal fracture because of a dry confusion in old notation. Only a truth with symbolic and political force could do that. Only a truth that cuts at ancestry, legitimacy, or inherited self-conception could split a brotherhood from within. This is where the theory of loyalist descent from a traitor legion ceases to feel melodramatic and begins to feel administratively plausible, not proven. never that, but plausible in precisely the way the Imperium most hates, useful enough to preserve, poisonous enough to suppress. A chapter descended, wholly or in part, from loyalists of a damned legion would be exactly the kind of problem the Imperium would rather lock in a vault than proclaim from a dais. Such a lineage would not be tainted in the conventional sense. It could fight loyally, bleed loyally, die loyally. It could serve for millennia without faltering in duty, and still its existence would threaten cherished simplifications about who may inherit honor and who may only inherit curse. Better, from the Imperial point of view, to compartmentalize such a truth. Better to classify, to narrow access, to limit knowledge to those capable of carrying contradiction without letting it spread like doctrinal plague. The Silver Skull's own file begins to look exactly like the kind of file such a truth would create. It also explains why the chapter's own leadership would fear disclosure. Imagine what such knowledge would do within the halls of Argent Mons, among warriors reared on the conviction that their blood descends through a line both sanctified and legible. Some would say that loyalty indeed matters more than any distant primarchal contamination, if contamination it can even be called when the sons in question never betrayed. Others would not. Others would hear only the word traitor, hear only the old hate of the heresy, hear only the thunder of 10,000 years of institutional contempt aimed at the legions that broke faith. Some would look upon their own honors and wonder whether they had been inherited under false names. Some would cling harder to the public genealogy, declaring any alternate origin an insult to the chapter's current oath and identity. Some would perhaps embrace the harsher truth, seeing in it not shame, but a fiercer kind of legitimacy bought by loyal bloodshed against a treacherous ancestry. None of that would be clean. None of that would remain private for long. A chapter need not fall to be fractured. It need only be forced to ask the wrong question about itself. So the investigation becomes, in the end, a study in institutional self-preservation. Not a cover-up because the Silver Skulls are damned. A cover-up because the Imperium needs the myth of clean, loyal lineage to survive even where reality may have become less tidy. That distinction is everything. If the chapter were corrupted, destruction would be the orthodox answer. But if the chapter is loyal and the truth merely intolerable, then concealment becomes the more efficient form of mercy. Mercy for the chapter. Mercy for the wider Adeptus Astartes. Mercy, if one wishes to use so diseased a word, for the larger mythology that still holds together a species already rotting beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The file is not protected because it hides a monster. It is protected because it may hide a precedent. And precedents are more dangerous than monsters. A monster can be killed. A precedent can spread. If one loyal chapter's blood can emerge from a line the Imperium publicly damns, then how many other sacred certainties begin to tremble? How many proud genealogies become matters not of faith, but of scrutiny? How many chapters look upon one another and begin to wonder whether purity has always been as simple as the sermons claimed? The Imperium does not survive such questions by answering them honestly. It survives by sealing them, narrowing them, suffocating them beneath holy language and restricted access until only a few authorized minds are burdened with the full contradiction. That is why secrecy itself must now be counted among the strongest pieces of evidence. Not secrecy alone, for secrecy without context is only atmosphere, but secrecy joined to exoneration from taint, joined to the threat of schism, joined to the extraordinary difficulty of access, joined to a chapter already wrapped in archival unease and behavioral echoes. At that point, the silence around the Silver Skulls stops feeling accidental. It starts to feel curated, and a curated silence is often the loudest thing in the archive. Now the gaze must lift from the chapter itself and turn toward the greater machine that would decide what may be spoken, what must be sealed, and what truths are too dangerous to be granted the dignity of open acknowledgement. This is no longer merely a matter of the silver skulls as warriors, nor of their customs, nor of their war record, nor even of the deep unease coiled around their blood archives. This is a matter of imperial politics, which is to say, it is a matter of survival through managed contradiction. The Imperium of man does not endure because it is honest. It endures because it knows which lies must be enthroned and which truths must be strangled in the dark before they acquire voices of their own. That is the scale on which this question must now be measured. For imagine, if only for a moment, what a confirmed loyalist dissent from a traitor legion would mean if publicly named and formally accepted, not whispered, not classified, not buried under inquisitorial seal and denied to all but a few sanctioned minds, confirmed, entered cleanly into the doctrinal body of the Imperium as fact, a loyal chapter, active in the Emperor's wars, free of proven taint, publicly acknowledged to carry the blood of one of the legions damned by the memory of the Horus Heresy. Such a revelation would not merely trouble the chronicle. It would strike at theology. It would strike at institutional memory. It would strike at the carefully maintained illusion that the lines of loyalty and treachery, once drawn in the age of the Primarchs, remained forever clean in the blood of those who came after. The Adeptus Astartes do not live only by gene seed. They live by myth. Purity, inheritance, and sanctioned memory are among the pillars upon which their identities rest. Each chapter carries not only organs and doctrines, but a story about itself, a sacred genealogy, a chain of names and origins that allows battle brothers to understand where they stand in the long procession of imperial war. To interfere with that chain is not some sterile administrative correction. It is sacrilege of a subtler and more devastating kind. It calls into question what can be trusted in the oldest claims of martial legitimacy. It forces a warrior to ask whether his chapter's self-understanding is truth, or whether it is simply the approved version of truth handed down because the real answer was judged too disruptive for broad consumption. And once that question is permitted once, it cannot easily be confined. That is part of the disaster. A single revealed exception never remains single for long within the imperial mind. If one loyal chapter may descend, in whole or in part, from a line publicly associated with treason, then what follows? What other sealed vaults begin to feel less secure? What other successor chapters, especially those of obscure founding or tangled record, fall beneath the same interrogative blade? How many old certainties begin to soften at the edges? How many proud recitations of primarchal descent become invitations to scrutiny rather than shields against it? The Imperium despises open-ended precedent because precedent breeds inquiry, and inquiry is among the most destabilizing appetites a loyal mind can acquire. That is why the heresy must remain morally simple in its broadest public shape, even though the truth of it was never simple at all. The official moral architecture of the Horus Heresy relies upon division that can be remembered cleanly. Loyal legions and traitor legions. Faith and apostasy. Duty and rebellion. That architecture has cracks everywhere for anyone strong enough to study the period honestly, but the wider Imperium cannot afford such honesty as common nourishment. It needs simplified memory, because simplified memory governs more easily. The sons of the loyal Primarchs are to be revered. The sons of the traitors are to be hated. That is not the whole truth, but it is a useful truth, and useful truths harden fastest into dogma. A public acknowledgement that loyal and successful Astartes institutions may descend from the blood of the condemned would not merely complicate an old war. It would erode the emotional machinery by which that war has been taught for 10,000 years. This is why Barabas Dantioch remains acceptable where a living chapter would not. Dantioch can be endured because he is singular, because he is dead, and because he died correctly. He is an exception wrapped in sacrifice, a martyr, a loyal son of a damned legion who gave all that remained of himself to the Emperor's cause, and left behind a memory the Imperium could sanctify without needing to alter its larger mythology. He does not breed consequences in the public imagination, because he can be placed safely among the noble dead. There is no administrative crisis in honoring a hero who no longer threatens to reproduce the contradiction of his own existence. He can be pointed to as proof of individual virtue without forcing the Empire to admit that institutional continuities may also have survived. That is the key distinction. An exception may be celebrated. A lineage must be managed. A living, successful chapter descended from such blood would be another matter entirely. A chapter fights. A chapter recruits. A chapter transmits gene seed. A chapter holds territory, enforces oaths, enters alliances, and stands within the immense lattice of Astartes' legitimacy. It cannot be dismissed as a beautiful anomaly. It persists. It accumulates victories. It demands recognition, not merely for one heroic life, but for a continuing inheritance. That is what makes the concept politically dangerous. Not that the chapter would necessarily be impure. Quite the opposite. A loyal and effective chapter with such ancestry would be much harder to destroy, and far harder still to denounce, without implicating the Imperium's own long history of using it. The Empire can annihilate monsters without shame. It is less comfortable annihilating useful servants whose only unforgivable trait is that their blood history makes public doctrine look childish. And if such a case did come before the highest and coldest minds of the Imperium, one can imagine the calculus with unpleasant ease. Robert Guilliman himself, if made aware in full, might well choose utility over public purity. That would not be weakness. It would be perfectly in keeping with the hardest and most uncomfortable truths of his character and his legacy. Guilliman is not merely a primarch of banners and civic ideals. He is a statesman of war, an architect of survival. He understands administration not as a moral ornament, but as a weapon sharpened for the preservation of function. If presented with a loyal chapter free of taint, proven in war, useful in the defense of the Imperium, and politically explosive in origin, it is not difficult to imagine him choosing concealment over spectacle. Better a weapon retained under managed silence than a public revelation that weakens the coherence of the wider Astartes inheritance. Better a classified truth than a doctrinal firestorm. Better, in the oldest imperial fashion, to preserve what works and lie about it if necessary. That is not cynicism. It is imperial logic in its purest form. The silence around such a matter should not be mistaken for frailty, nor for embarrassment alone, nor for some childish inability to face the past. It is strategy. What functions must be preserved, whatever lie is required. That is the rule beneath the rule. The Imperium is an empire of containment. It contains demons in warded vaults. It contains worlds in tithes and garrisons. It contains populations in fear, institutions in doctrine, archives in classification, and history itself in narratives scrubbed clean enough to be useful. A dangerous truth is not suppressed because the rulers of mankind are delicate. It is suppressed because governance depends upon deciding which realities may circulate freely and which must remain strangled beneath seal and oath. Under that logic, contain and classify becomes far more plausible than condemn and destroy, especially where the silver skulls are concerned. They are useful. They are active. They have not been shown to carry obvious taint. Their war record speaks in loyal blood. Their public role near Ultramar only deepens their strategic value. A chapter like that is not the kind of thing the Imperium wishes to cast into flame unless there is no alternative. But to acknowledge a politically unbearable origin would be to inflict another kind of damage, one that spreads not through mutation or rebellion, but through thought. Better, then, to keep the contradiction localized. Better to allow the chapter to continue serving under its approved history, while the deeper truth, whatever exact form it takes, remains in the care of those few who understand that statecraft and sanctity have never truly been the same thing. This is why the problem of the Silver Skulls has always felt larger than the chapter itself. It is not merely their secret that matters. It is what their secret would do to the machinery around them if ever spoken too loudly. The Imperium does not fear only what is false, nor only what is foul. It fears what it cannot govern once known. And that, in the end, is the lesson that stains this whole question, darker than simple heresy ever could. In the 41st millennium, the most dangerous truth is often not the least believable. It is the least governable. A theory that cannot survive honest resistance is not a theory. It is appetite dressed in armor. So the blade must be turned now, not outward, but inward, against everything argued thus far. If the suspicion surrounding the Silver Skulls is to deserve any continued breath at all, then the strongest conservative case must be given its due in full severity. No muttering evasions, no selective memory, no indulgence in the pleasing drama of half-proven bloodlines. The case against the theory begins with the most brutal and obvious fact of all. Official law still lists the Silver Skulls as an Ultramarines successor chapter. They are not publicly recorded as an uncertain fragment of some half-lost founding. They are not filed as a nameless anomaly, awaiting brave revisionists to rescue them from archival error. The sanctioned record says Ultramarines. It says they are one of the shield chapters of Ultramar. It says they behave as a codex chapter, fight alongside the primogenitor chapters as kin, and were recognized as one of the scions of Guilliman after the Primarch's return. That is not a minor obstacle to the theory. It is the central obstacle. And because it is central, it must be treated with the seriousness it deserves. The Silver Skulls are not merely tolerated on the edge of Guilliman's inheritance. They stand within it in the public and functional sense that matters most to the Imperium. They are counted among Ultramar's defenders. They are accepted within the grammar of Ultramarine legitimacy. They have fought and served under that assumption for ages. A serious reader cannot simply wave this aside and claim that all official record is worthless the moment it becomes inconvenient. If one does that, then every chapter becomes infinitely malleable, every archive becomes meaningless, and law itself dissolves into preference. The conservative reading begins by refusing that collapse. It says the simplest answer may still be the strongest one. The Silver Skulls are exactly what the Imperium says they are, an ultramarine successor with unusual shadows hanging over an otherwise accepted inheritance. Then there is Varavia, and Varavia is no small thing. Much of what makes the Silver Skulls feel harsh, sepulchral, and alien to the brighter public image of many ultramarine descendants is rooted not in any obvious preserved Iron Warriors tradition, but in the culture of the world that recruits them. The chapter draws from Varavia's fierce tribesmen. It buries its warriors upon Pax Argentius. It preserves the ashes of the fallen in urns after prayer rites. It layers the skulls of worthy enemies in silver and displays them within the fortress monastery. It carries a reputation as headhunters because Varavian culture bled into the chapter over time. Read plainly, that is not the fingerprint of a hidden 4th Legion identity preserved in pristine form. It is the mark of a chapter deeply shaped by its homeworld, just as many chapters are shaped by Fenris, Baal, Nocturne, or any other crucible that feeds them their sons. The savage beauty of the Silver Skulls may owe more to Varavia than to any buried primarchal secret. The same pressure falls even more heavily when one considers the prognosticators. They are not some incidental flourish. They are one of the chapter's defining features. The Silver Skulls place extraordinary value on the visions of these psychers, so much so that the prognosticators stand as a major part of the chapter's identity and guide the path of its wars. That is difficult to reconcile with the bluntest version of the Iron Warriors theory, because the popular image of the 4th Legion is not one of prophecy-led command culture. It is the image of siege minds, engineers of attrition, method and bitterness made flesh. The Silver Skulls, by contrast, are a chapter in which portents and foresight occupy unusual weight. That does not disprove every subtler theory of hidden blood, but it does wound the crude one. If they carry any such inheritance, it has been buried beneath a culture so transformed that the chapter no longer resembles an obvious continuation of the Fourth Legion in spirit or custom. Nor can one ignore the matter of Barabas Dantioch's clearest legacy, because here the conservative case grows stronger still. The most explicit named material inheritance tied to Dantioch does not belong to the Silver Skulls. It belongs to the scythes of the Emperor. His mask remained associated with Sotha, and later became a badge of office for the Scythe's chapter master. If one were seeking the chapter most openly marked by Dantioch's memorial continuation, the record points elsewhere. That does not kill every shadowed possibility, but it does warn against overreaching. The Silver Skulls are not the obvious Dantioch heirs in the direct relic sense, and any theory that treats them as though the record plainly does so is already drifting from evidence into wish. This is where discipline matters most. One must not treat every skull motif as secret proof of Iron Warrior's descent. One must not look at siege preference and immediately cry, perturabo. The 41st millennium is drowning in convergent aesthetics, shared battlefield roles, and traditions layered over older truths until origin becomes difficult to disentangle from adaptation. Skull imagery is ubiquitous across the Imperium. Siege warfare is not the private sacrament of one legion alone. Grim chapters exist because the galaxy rewards grim chapters. Severe doctrines arise because the enemies of mankind are severe enough to demand them. The Silver Skulls may look iron to suspicious eyes, not because they are secretly iron warriors, but because the Imperium produces many forms of hard-edged loyalty when war is all that remains. Even the records problem, powerful as it is, does not compel a single answer. Yes, the gene seed files were heavily classified. Yes, Inquisitor Leandra Callis struggled to obtain them. Yes, the final result ruled out taint and mutation while raising fears of schism if the chapter's origins became widely known. Those facts are real, and they remain the theory's strongest fuel. But the conservative reading is not forced to concede the whole argument at that point. It can still say this: mysterious origins do not automatically equal traitor-line descent. There are many reasons the Imperium might fear internal fracture over bloodline revelation. Political embarrassment, fragmented records, conflicts between tradition and evidence, a founding history altered by necessity, or some other inheritance strange enough to wound chapter identity without requiring direct descent from a condemned legion. The unknown is not automatically the most dramatic possibility, merely because the dramatic possibility is attractive. So the strongest conservative reading stands like this: the Silver Skulls are what the record says they are, an Ultramarine successor chapter, accepted among Ultramar's defenders, shaped by Varavia into a death-haunted and severe brotherhood, guided unusually strongly by its prognosticators, and carrying genealogical mysteries that remain sensitive without therefore proving the most explosive explanation. Their siege specialization may be real without being inherited from the Fourth Legion. Their iconography may be ominous without being confessional. Their records may be guarded because they are unusual, not because they are politically unbearable in the specific way the theory suggests. In this reading, the chapter is not secretly something else. It is simply itself, which in Warhammer is often mystery enough. That case deserves respect because it is coherent, law-safe, and rooted in the plainest available record. It does not need fever or embellishment to stand. It merely needs restraint, and that is why this chapter cannot be avoided. Any serious treatment of the Silver Skulls theory must survive this resistance, or it deserves to die here, under the weight of the official record it seeks to challenge. The theory must now be rebuilt or abandoned, not defended in its weakest form, because weak forms deserve death, not propped up by fevered certainty, by the kind of overeager hunger that sees a skull badge and cries revelation before the archive door has even begun to open. Not preserved by pretending the silver skulls are secretly and openly the sons of Perturabo in every visible respect, as though 10,000 years of chapter history, homeworld culture, codified discipline, and ritual transformation could be peeled away like old paint to reveal a perfect legion relic beneath. That is not how history survives in the Imperium. That is not how blood survives. That is not how institutions survive. If the theory is to live at all, it must live in a harder, colder, more disciplined form. So discard the crude version first. The Silver Skulls are not openly iron warriors in doctrine, culture, and allegiance. They are not merely the Fourth Legion wearing a silver mask. They are not a preserved shard of heresy identity, marching unchanged through the millennia beneath a forged name and hoping no one notices. Their culture is too transformed for that. Varavia has entered them too deeply. Their prognosticators stand too near the center of their command life. Their funerary customs, ancestor reverence, skull silvering, and homeworld-shaped austerities belong too powerfully to the chapter they have become. Their public role among Ultramar's defenders is too integrated, their codex-shaped order too functional, their long history too fully lived. Any theory that requires them to remain culturally and operationally identical to the old image of the Fourth Legion is already broken. But that does not kill the question. It clarifies it. The strongest version of the theory is not that the Silver Skulls are truly iron warriors in any simple present tense sense. It is that they may descend, in whole or in meaningful part, from Loyalist iron warriors quietly folded into a post-heresy loyal structure under ultramarine sanction, their old origin buried beneath more acceptable designation until the burial itself became tradition, and the tradition hardened into official history. There, at last, the shape becomes worth respecting, because that version asks less of the evidence and receives more from it. It does not require a theatrical concealment that somehow preserved every old Legion feature in plain sight. It requires instead what the Imperium is already known to do better than almost any human empire in fiction or memory. It requires absorption, reclassification, politically necessary silence, the transformation of a dangerous truth into a manageable institution. It requires a handful of Loyalist survivors, or a body of gene-line inheritance linked to Loyalist stock, passing through the slaughterhouse of the post-heresy order and emerging under a cleaner, more governable name, not to deceive the galaxy for sport, to preserve a useful weapon while avoiding a doctrinal catastrophe. That fits the setting far better than the childish fantasy of a hidden legion preserved in amber. And once that version is admitted, the rest of the evidence arranges itself with much greater coherence. Begin with the public record. The Silver Skulls are listed as an ultramarine successor. Good. In the strongest theory, that is not a flaw. It is expected. A loyal structure under ultramarine sanction would be precisely the kind of umbrella beneath which such a bloodline could be regularized, legitimized, and made survivable within the Imperial order that followed the Legion's ruin. The primacy of the Ultramarines in the age after the Heresy, the authority of Guilliman, the reorganization of the Adeptus Astartes into chapters, the desperate need to impose order upon the wreck of civil war, all of it creates the perfect political weather for such a concealment. If loyal Iron Warriors stock were to be preserved at all, it would make far more sense for that preservation to occur through incorporation into a stable and acceptable framework than through some openly declared anomaly daring the rest of the Imperium to cope. Then look at what time would do. Over centuries, over millennia, Varavia would shape them. Of course it would. Recruitment worlds always do. The tribes would leave their marks. Ancestor veneration would enter the chapter's marrow. Trophy customs would become sacred custom. The skull would stop being mere heraldry and become memory, warning, burden, and proof. Chaplains would sanctify what began as tribal instinct. Captains would absorb it into discipline. Librarians would not simply tolerate prophecy, but incorporate it into warcraft. The Codex Astartes, too, would do its work, sanding down some edges, preserving others, giving the chapter a loyal grammar through which to understand itself. Chapter-specific rites would accumulate on top of that. Near extinctions, campaigns, heroes, failures, local devotions, the slow pressure of history itself. In time, the old Legion identity would not survive as visible culture. It would be buried beneath new forms so completely that even the Battle Brothers themselves would no longer know where the deepest layer began. This is how the strongest version survives the Varavia problem rather than dying on it, because Varavia is not evidence against the theory in any absolute sense. It is evidence against a simplistic theory. It proves the chapter became itself. That is all. It does not prove the deepest blood beneath that self is precisely what the public record claims. In fact, if the theory is right, Varavia is part of what made the concealment stable. A new world, a new recruitment culture, a new body of rights, all of it would help overwrite old Legion memory with living chapter identity. The more the Silver Skulls became unmistakably themselves, the safer the buried origin would become. Now the schism problem begins to fit with real precision. A truth of this kind would not damn the chapter. That is the beauty and the horror of it. If the Silver Skulls were tainted, corrupted, or mutated in the vulgar Imperial sense, the answer would be simpler. Censure, purge, excommunication, fire. But Loyalist dissent from a traitor legion's loyal remnants is far worse from the perspective of institutional stability, because it creates contradiction without offering easy condemnation. The chapter would remain what it has always been indeed: loyal, proven, active in war, free of obvious taint, and yet the revelation would fracture how the Brotherhood understands itself. Some would say blood matters less than service. Others would say identity built on a false lineage is identity wounded at the root. Some would look at their honors and feel them burn hotter. Others would feel them cool into doubt. A battle brother could remain loyal and still be torn apart by what his loyalty now means. That is exactly the kind of truth capable of causing schism within the chapter. Not because the chapter is damned, but because it would no longer agree on the story of its own soul. The same logic fits Imperial behavior with equal force. Conceal the origin, preserve the asset, let history calcify into orthodoxy. That is not a clumsy patch applied to the theory after the fact. It is the core mechanism by which the theory becomes believable. The Imperium does this as reflex. It classifies where openness would damage function. It sanctifies what it needs to preserve. It edits the past into governable forms. A loyal chapter, with politically unbearable ancestry, would not be an object of pure destruction unless its continued existence posed greater danger than the revelation required to destroy it. If it remained useful, if it remained loyal, if it stood where the Imperium needed it to stand, then concealment would be not merely plausible, but almost inevitable. Under that reading, the sealed records stop looking incidental. They become the administrative scar left by the rewrite. Not a random bureaucratic irritation, not meaningless confusion. A scar. Something healed over badly because the wound beneath it could not be left open. Leandra Callis struggled to obtain the records because records of this kind would have to be difficult to obtain. The chapter was cleared of taint, yet its origins were still treated as dangerous because origins, not corruption, were the live explosive buried in the vault. The difficulty of access, the sensitivity, the fear of internal schism, all of it begins to align around one coherent administrative motive. The file is not hard to reach because the Imperium forgot. It is hard to reach because the Imperium remembered too well and chose concealment over confession. Then there is the Siege Company, and here again the strongest version tightens. The 9th Company redesign is no longer forced to bear impossible weight. It need not prove open Fourth Legion identity. It need only survive as a doctrinal fossil, one old instinct preserved not because anyone consciously wished to honor the Iron Warriors, but because the chapter found that mode of war natural, effective, and worth institutionalizing. That is how buried inheritance often persists, not as a spoken truth, but as a preference that outlasts explanation. Siegecraft is where the old echo would most plausibly remain audible, because siegecraft is not mere decoration. It is a way of thinking about pressure, structure, and victory. A chapter may forget the first name of such instinct, while continuing to organize itself around the instinct itself. In that light, the siege company becomes something wonderfully unsettling, not proof of secret identity, a fossil, the trace of an older martial habit surviving inside a brotherhood that no longer remembers why the habit feels so natural. And Dantioch returns now in his proper place, not as founder, not as direct father of the Silver Skulls in some simplistic bloodline tale, as precedent, as the historical fact that makes the entire concept thinkable. Without Dantioch, the theory still exists perhaps, but in a much thinner and more desperate form. With him, Loyalist Fourth Legion inheritance ceases to be fantasy and becomes a real possibility within the architecture of heresy history. He proves the blood could remain loyal. He proves such men could stand in ultramarine orbit during the most consequential reorganization in human history. He proves that not all of the Fourth Legion rotted into treason. That is enough. More than enough. The theory does not require him to have personally founded the chapter. It requires only that his existence, and the existence of men like him, open the door through which such a concealed inheritance could one day pass. This is why the strongest version is so much more dangerous than the weaker ones. It asks for less and explains more. It explains how the Silver Skulls can be publicly ultramarine successors while still carrying a hidden anomaly. It explains how Varavia and chapter-specific culture can dominate without disproving an older bloodroot. It explains why the truth would cause schism without requiring corruption. It explains why the records would be sealed, why the Imperium would preserve the chapter rather than destroy it, why the siege company matters, and why Dantioch looms over the question without needing to stand at its literal origin point. Most importantly, it does not try to defeat the official record head-on. It slips beneath it. The Silver Skulls may be exactly what the Imperium says they are now. That is the unsettling part. They may truly be, in every functional present tense, an ultramarine successor chapter, loyal to the Imperium, shaped by Varavia, disciplined by the Codex, transformed into something wholly their own. And beneath that present truth, there may still rest an older blood truth, buried so long and so thoroughly that both stories are real in different layers. That is the version of the theory worth carrying forward. Not canon confirmation, not a shouted certainty, not some smug announcement that the case is closed and the vault has yielded every answer. Nothing so childish. It is a theory, a law-safe theory, but it is the most coherent form the theory can take, because it fits not just isolated details, but the setting's deeper habits of concealment, reinvention, and useful silence. In a universe built from sealed archives, rewritten lineages, martyrs turned into symbols, and truths smothered until they harden into orthodoxy, it is precisely the kind of theory the setting itself seems built to shelter. Now the matter may be judged, not settled. The Imperium does not permit settlement in such things, not cleansed into certainty, because certainty is a luxury of lesser settings and gentler ages, but judged, as all dangerous histories must finally be judged, by weighing what is said in the open against what groans beneath seal, by measuring public doctrine against private discomfort, by asking not what answer flatters the empire, but what answer best explains the pressure gathering around the name. The official truth remains what it has always been. The Silver Skulls are loyal. They fight as loyalists, bleed as loyalists, and stand where the Imperium needs them to stand. They do not come slithering from the warp, trailing the stink of easy damnation. They do not wear the obvious rot of corruption upon their flesh. Their warplate is not that of renegades. Their record is not one of apostasy. They have fought in the Emperor's wars with all the cold discipline and transhuman ferocity expected of the Adeptus Astartes. They are counted among the defenders of Ultramar. They are named among Guilliman's broader scions. They have held the line in the sort of campaigns that kill romance and leave only duty behind. They have shed blood where the Imperium required blood, and they have done so without the visible taint that would make this question simpler and far less interesting. That official truth must be granted its full weight, because anything less would turn the whole inquiry into self-indulgent nonsense. The Silver Skulls are not pretenders in the common sense. They are not cosplaying loyalty beneath a silvered lie. They are loyal in the only way the Imperium finally measures loyalty, by service rendered in blood, by worlds held, by enemies slain, by centuries of obedience paid into a machine that never stops demanding more. That part is real. That part has never been the true problem. The forbidden truth, or at least the forbidden pressure that circles truth closely enough to smell like it, is something else entirely. Something about their bloodline has never sat comfortably in the open record. Something in the archives surrounding them behaves less like a settled inheritance and more like a managed wound. Their lineage is not discussed with the easy confidence one expects of a chapter so publicly accepted. Access to the deeper record has been difficult. Investigation has ruled out vulgar taint, yet left the matter dangerous all the same. The language attached to that danger points not toward mutation, nor demonic stain, nor obvious apostasy, but toward origin, toward a truth that would not damn the chapter in action, but disturb the chapter in identity, toward a secret capable not of proving them monsters, but of making their own understanding of themselves untenable. That distinction is everything, and if it is not grasped, then the whole matter is lost beneath the clumsy boots of weaker thought. The question has never truly been whether the Silver Skulls are morally corrupted. It has never been whether they are secretly traitors in waiting, whether they kneel in hidden chapels to the old powers of the eye, whether their gene seed crawls with mutation, while their chaplains chant louder to drown out the warp song in the walls. Those are stupid questions, or at best, secondary ones. The records already push against them. The Silver Skulls have been examined closely enough for such crude fears to lose much of their bite. The deeper question is historical. It is genealogical. It is political in the most poisonous and enduring way. Not what are they now, but what were they first. Not whether they have fallen, but whether they began somewhere the Imperium would rather never name aloud. That is why this theory survives. Not because it is sensational, though it is. Not because it is emotionally pleasing to those who hunger for hidden inversions in every sealed archive, though such men certainly exist in no short supply. It survives because it explains the tension better than the alternatives. Public ultramarines, private anomaly, a chapter whose loyalty is useful, whose record is strong, whose bloodline is somehow still too sensitive to rest easily among the ordinary certainties of imperial inheritance. And from there, the conclusion turns grim in the proper way. The Imperium may have no problem using such warriors. It may only have a problem naming them. That is the coldest reading, and therefore the most believable. The Empire of Man has never required historical cleanliness to make use of a weapon. It requires function. It requires obedience. It requires that the bolter fire when commanded, that the fortress hold when besieged, that the enemy die when the order is given. If a chapter can do all these things, and do them for centuries without open deviation, then the question of what old blood first made them becomes not a moral crisis, but an administrative one, a theological one, a problem of presentation, of precedent, of how much contradiction the wider structure can absorb before its myths begin to crack in public view. In such circumstances, the simplest solution is the one the Imperium has always preferred. Keep the weapon, seal the truth, maintain the fiction. Let usefulness outlive honesty, as usefulness always does. That is why the Silver Skulls feel untouchable and unresolved at once. Untouchable, because their loyalty in action is too proven, their service too useful, their public integration too deep for easy denunciation. Unresolved, because the pressure in the record never fully disperses, because every answer given in the open seems to carry just enough strain to suggest an answer withheld beneath it. They are not fringe enough to ignore, not monstrous enough to destroy, not transparent enough to quiet suspicion. They occupy that most dangerous of Imperial categories, the category of the necessary discomfort. Too valuable to lose, too destabilizing to explain. This is where all the threads tighten together. The official record says Ultramarine's successor. Fine. The strongest version of the theory does not need to deny that in the present tense. The Silver Skulls may indeed function as exactly that now, in doctrine, in allegiance, in the administrative language by which chapters are named and placed. Their loyalty is real. Their codex-shaped structure is real, though not perfect. Their place among Ultramar's defenders is real. Varsavia's influence upon them is real, profound, and irreducible. Their prognosticators are real, and make them far stranger than any lazy notion of preserved Fourth Legion culture would allow. All of this stands, and still, the other truths stand with it. The records are uneasy, the access is difficult, the concern is origin, not corruption. The danger is schism, not taint. Dantioch proves loyal blood from the Fourth Legion existed and mattered in the very era when new loyal structures were forged from Civil War wreckage. The most visible relic line of his legacy runs elsewhere, toward the Scythes, which paradoxically makes a quieter bloodline inheritance more plausible, not less, because public symbol and hidden continuity are not the same thing. The Siege Company endures as an institutional clue, too pointed to dismiss easily, not proof of dissent, but a doctrinal fossil whose persistence suggests that some old instinct may have survived the rewrite, even if the name of that instinct was buried long ago. So the final line of argument is no longer difficult to state, only difficult to stomach. The Silver Skulls are publicly what the Imperium needs them to be: an Ultramarine successor, a loyal chapter, a shield around Ultramar, a force of stern and death-haunted warriors who nevertheless stand within the acceptable order of Imperial war. Privately, at the level of sealed blood truth and politically unutterable ancestry, they may be something the Imperium could survive using, but not survive naming, not traitors, not monsters. Something worse for an empire built on myth, a contradiction that functions. This is the shape of the thing, and it fits the setting too cleanly to dismiss with comfort. The Imperium does not collapse because it lacks secrets. It survives because it learns which secrets must be weighted, chained, and lowered into the deepest wells. A loyal chapter with blood tied, however distantly or partially, to the loyal remnants of a traitor legion would be exactly such a secret, damning if misunderstood, explosive if proclaimed, manageable only so long as it remains trapped between the approved record and the few hands permitted to know better. There will always be those who say that ambiguity alone is not enough. They are right. Ambiguity is not confirmation. It is not canon stamped in gold and raised above challenge. But here the ambiguity is not random haze. It is structured. It has motive. It sits at the intersection of all the pressures that matter in Warhammer history: gene seed secrecy, founding myth, the politics of the heresy, the survivability of loyalist anomalies, the administrative habits of an empire that classifies before it confesses. The law leaves just enough room for the theory to breathe, and not enough certainty to make it dull. That is not weakness. That is what makes the premise powerful. The setting does not present the answer as official fact because the setting is more interesting and more truthful to itself. When certain truths remain useful, precisely because they cannot be ratified without damage. And what would that damage be if the whole thing were ever dragged into hard daylight? It would not be the corruption of the Silver Skulls. Their deeds already answer that charge better than any sermon. It would be the corruption of the story the Imperium tells itself about blood, legitimacy, and the clean separation of the heresy's lines. It would reveal that the Empire has perhaps been doing what it always does, taking what can still fight, what can still endure, what can still hold a wall or grind a war down to bones, and placing a better name over it until memory itself submits. It would reveal that loyalty is not always born from clean origins. That useful blood need not come from honored lines. That a chapter may stand in full faith beneath banners of accepted descent, while some older and more bitter inheritance sleeps beneath the silver. That is why the chapter feels so perfectly Warhammer. Not because the answer is pretty, not because the truth, if true, would heal anything. Because it would not. It would only confirm that in this age, as in all the darkest corners of the Imperium, function devours purity and then demands to be praised for its holiness. So let the final image remain what it has always been. Silver armor catching a dead world's light, a skull badge gleaming like a polished relic of mortality, siege-born reputation, calculating severity, a chapter marching in disciplined silence beneath a name that may conceal as much as it reveals, carrying honor in one hand and some buried, unspeakable inheritance in the other, whether they know it or not. The Silver Skulls may be the loyalist iron warriors the Imperium needs, and the chapter no one wants confirmed.